At the city lord's castle, Michael handed the documents that he was holding over to Dicus as he said, "Take this to the principal. The first batch of funds for Miss Luna's foundation has already arrived. The city lord's castle will only be responsible for supervision, but won't interfere with the operation of the foundation in any way. Also, due to the expected influx of elven children into the city in the near future, the city lord's castle will also be contributing some funds to the foundation so Chaos School can hire more teachers and update their facilities in order to enroll more children." "All right." Dicus accepted the documents in a serious manner before turning to leave. "Make some arrangements, I'm going to pay a visit to the headquarters of the Grey Temple," Michael instructed the employee standing outside the door before also making his way outside. As he did so, a smile appeared on his face, and he thought to himself, seeing as even Alex has made an announcement, it's time for us to do something. If those demons and orcs dare to try and target Chaos City, they're going to pay a heavy price. Thus, a black horse-drawn carriage departed from the city lord's castle headed toward the western part of the city, where the headquarters of the Grey Temple was situated. The headquarters of the Grey Temple was an angular grey stone building that appeared to be quite solemn and intimidating, but all of the people passing through the streets near the building were quite relaxed. Many of them wore expressions of awe and veneration as they cast their eyes toward the building. Not only did the Grey Temple exist to regulate the actions of all of Chaos City's citizens, they also served to protect the citizens from the outside world. They represented the order of Chaos City, and also the bottom line that couldn't be breached. A black horse-drawn carriage stopped outside the gates, and Michael disembarked from it. An elderly elf in a set of long grey robes, who stood in front of the grey building, nodded to acknowledge Michael's arrival. Michael looked at the elderly elf with a serious expression, and said, "Roland, the elven race is undergoing drastic changes, and Alex has reappeared, it's about time we did something." As Mag was passing by the blue suede clothing store, he stopped outside to take a quick glance at it. He discovered that there wasn't even a single item of clothing within the shop, and that there was a sign hanging from the door that read "New products are in production, please stay tuned." Even so, there were still noble women in lavish clothing constantly visiting the shop, asking the employees for an exact time and date of reopening, to which the employees could only apologetically reply that they didn't know. At the sight of all of the dejected noble women walking away from the shop, Mag shook his head with an amused smile. It appeared that Gloria was already employing hunger marketing tactics to increase the level of interest in her shop. Everything appeared to be heading in the right direction, and all they had to do now was increase production capacity in order to keep up with demand. Aside from high-end female clothing, a large market also lies in mid-range and low-end female attire. However, production costs are still far too high at the moment. Once the steam engine becomes popularized, an industrial revolution will follow, Mag thought to himself as he continued riding his bicycle back to his restaurant. With the enormous wealth of the Buffett family and the skilled laborers provided by the city lord's castle, it most likely wouldn't take too long for the steam engine and the steam train to be popularized. Furthermore, the Norland continent was starting to enter a period of instability, so the Buffet family wanted more than anyone to have more useful cards that they could play. The profitability of banks relied heavily on a stable market, so its income was not always reliable during volatile times. As such, Mag didn't have to be concerned in the slightest that the implementation of the steam engine scheme would be delayed. Both the city lord's castle and the Buffett family were clearly extremely interested in this project. Beside a lake in the Buffett manor, Sheer sat beside Ian, who was holding a fishing rod in his hand, and she said in an excited voice, "Grandpa, after repeated projections, our brains trust has basically confirmed that popularization of the steam engine and the steam train would completely transform the current energy systems, and impact everyone's daily lives in all aspects. Those inventions will push the entire world into a new era, and all industries will be able to achieve a level of staggering efficiency that would have been unimaginable in the past. Cheap coal mines will become extremely important resources, and as the pioneer behind this revolution, not only will our Buffett family be reaping significant profits in the long run, our status and position in the world will also enjoy a meteoric rise. Ian turned to Sheer and appraised her carefully for a moment before smiling as he said, "I've rarely ever seen you this excited, Sheer. The last time I saw you this worked up was back when you were preparing to implement the deposit system." A smile also appeared on Sheer's face as she replied, "Change always fills one with excitement. Ventures into the unknown can always lead to brilliant opportunities. I'm not a fan of taking risks, but I'm filled with interest in the unknown. However, ever since King Andre's birthday banquet, the Norland continent has become rather unstable. Alex has returned from the dead, then killed 6 10th-tier powerful beings, including Benson, with Irina by his side. After that, Chaos City announced that they'd be offering refuge to all wandering elves, and I've just received news from the Wind Forest that the Elven Queen has gone into seclusion, and Irina has been deposed as princess." Alex then made a public declaration that he'd be fighting for all wandering elves, thereby establishing a stance against the Wind Forest, the same stance that has been adopted by Chaos City. A slightly grim expression appeared on Sheer's face as she continued, "During the re-signing of the peace treaty in 3 months, it's most likely the case that all of the races won't be able to reach a consensus, and another war among species could even break out soon. Do you think this will affect our Buffett family in any way?" Ian asked with a smile. The demons, orcs, and forest trolls initially had the initiative and wanted to start something, but they've lost over 10 10th-tier powerful beings in the past 3 years. In contrast, Alex has returned from the dead, thereby significantly bolstering the power of the human race. It's unknown whether they'll forge a new alliance with the elves and the dwarves, but even if no large-scale wars will break out in the short term, if the peace treaty isn't re-signed, wars will inevitably break out on many borders. The relationships between all of the races will also rapidly deteriorate, and that could prove to be a lethal blow to our banks. The protection clauses signed between our banks and all of the races could be void, and war will prevent money from circulating between races, thereby spelling doom for our banks. As such, I think the most important thing for us now is to popularize the steam engine and the steam train as quickly as possible so all races can develop an interest in it. When that time comes, the steam engine will become our Buffett family's most important asset, which could perhaps also save our banks. Even in the worst-case scenario, we'll be able to rely on the steam engine to cement ourselves a place in this world," Sheer analyzed with a solemn expression. "Do you know what is the wisest decision I've made ever since I decided to enter the business world?" Ian asked with a smile. Sheer thought about this for a moment before replying, "Founding Buffett Banks." "No, the wisest decision I've made is making you the successor to the Buffett family," Ian corrected with a shake of his head. "Father, what are those ugly ducks?" Not long after Mag returned to the restaurant, Amy also returned from her lessons. "That's about right." Mag looked down at the pair of red-top tricolor ducks huddled together on the floor, and decided that ugly ducks was quite an apt name for them. "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling was also looking on from the side with a curious expression. "Did you go off to find parents for Ugly Duckling? They're just as Ugly Duckling." Amy's eyes lit up as she picked up Ugly Duckling, then placed it beside the 2 ducks as she nodded, and said, "They really do look identical." "Really?" Both Mag and Krasu, who had accompanied Amy back to the restaurant, raised their eyebrows in unison. "This is how a family should be." Amy nodded in a content manner before turning to Mag with an expectant look on her face as she asked, "Father, are we have roast duck today?" "Meow, meow, meow, meow." Ugly Duckling immediately cried out in a panicked manner, and then frantically pointed at the 3 ducks with one of its paws before pointing back at itself as if it were trying to announce that they were completely different creatures. Amy pressed Ugly Duckling's little paw back to its side, and smiled as she said, "I get it, you're very happy that you've found your parents. I'm also very happy for you, so I think we should have a celebration tonight." Ugly Duckling stared at Amy with wide, horrified eyes as if it were looking at a terrifying demon. Mag was quite amused by the interaction between Amy and Ugly Duckling, but he was rather taken aback by what he saw when he turned his attention to Krasu. "Master Krasu, what happened to your beard?" Krasu held his own beard in extremely high regard, and he'd been very depressed for a long time after half of it had been burned away by a fireball unleashed by Amy. After carefully nurturing it ever since then, the beard had grown significantly longer, but for some reason, it was almost completely gone now. "Well, I heard that long beards aren't popular nowadays, so I decided to try cutting it short." Krasu felt as if his heart were bleeding, but he still forced himself to keep up a cheerful facade. What else could he do? Tell everyone that his beard had been burned away by his own disciple? "Then why were you crying when you cut your beard, Master Half-Beard?" Amy asked as she looked up at him with a curious expression. Those were tears of joy. Krasu was clearly feeling rather uncomfortable with this topic, and he suddenly changed the subject as he turned to the pair of ducks on the ground, and said, "Let's talk about the roast ducks we're going to have tonight." "Yes, yes." As expected, Amy's interest was immediately drawn away by the prospect of roast ducks. After explaining the situation over and over again, Mag was finally able to convince the two not to eat the 3 ducks. He hadn't opened the experience bag yet, nor had he studied the practiced making the dish in the test field for the god of cookery, so he was naturally still unable to cook traditional Chuanjude Peking duck. Meow. Ugly Duckling sidled over to the pair of ducks with a pitiable expression on its face, seemingly resigned to the fact that it had now been categorized as a duck. The 2 red-topped tricolor ducks opened their wings before encircling them around Ugly Duckling, creating a scene that was akin to a touching family reunion. Mag cooked some dinner for Amy and Krasu, and following Krasu's departure, Amy stood at the entrance of the restaurant, looking up at Mag with an expectant gaze. "Father, can we go and see the little sister at Uncle Blue Fatty's house?" "Of course we can," Mag replied with a nod and a smile. The restaurant was supposed to be closed for business for the entire day, so he didn't have to open it for the dinner service. On top of that, he had some affinity with those twins, so he also wanted to pay them a visit. "Wait for me here, I'm going to prepare some things," Mag said before making his way into the kitchen. 15 minutes later, Mag carried a lunchbox and a small gift box as he rode away on his bicycle with Amy in the back. Harrison had given him George's address before, and after asking a few passers-by for directions along the way, Mag was able to successfully arrive at his destination. After being notified of Mag and Amy's arrival, George hurriedly rushed out of the door with a surprised look on his face, and asked, "Boss Mag, little Amy. Why are you two here?" "Uncle Blue Fatty, we're here to see my little sister," Amy said with a smile as she cast her gaze into the courtyard in a curious manner, and asked, "Where is she?" Meanwhile, Mag handed over the boxes he was carrying to George with a smile, and said, "This is a portion of Yangzhou fried rice for your wife, and this is a present for your kids." "Oh, you really shouldn't have, Boss Mag. Please come in." George accepted the boxes with a smile before turning to Amy as he said, "Your little sister is inside, let me take you to her." 2 servants strode out before carefully carrying Mag's bicycle into the courtyard while Mag and Amy followed George into his house. George was living in what was considered to be an affluent area in Chaos City. The city championed the concept of freedom, but that didn't mean that there was no wealth gap in the city. George's family had a few shops and businesses that were quite profitable, but they could only be considered an affluent middle-class family that still couldn't compare with the likes of the Buffett family. However, the courtyard was constructed in quite an organized manner, with a little garden that had clearly been taken care of very well, thereby reflecting their wealth as well as Miranda's aesthetic standards. A little boy who appeared to be around 3 years of age rushed over to Amy, and he spread open his little arms as he mumbled, "Big sister! Big sister! I want a hug! I want to be raised up high! Do you think you'll suddenly become more adorable just because you're calling me big sister?" Amy asked in a calm manner. Parber's footsteps faltered, and he stared at Amy in a confused manner with his little arms still raised aloft. No matter what you say, you still haven't become an adorable little sister. I hope you can realize that. Amy shook her head before brushing past Parber in a cool and aloof manner. Big sister won't hug me. Wah! Parber lips puckered as he burst into tears. Haha, don't cry, Parber, let's go and see your little brother and little sister, Trjay hurriedly consoled as he bent down to scoop Parber up in his arms. I'm really sorry about this. Amy, Mag began in an apologetic manner. Trjay shook his head with a smile, and said, there's no need to apologize, Boss Mag. I know that little Amy is a kind little girl, it's just that she only likes little sisters. Thus, Trjay and Mag continued into the courtyard. Miranda was still breastfeeding her newborn daughter at the moment, so it was naturally inappropriate for Mag to go in. As such, only Amy followed Trjay into the room. Not long after that, Amy's elated voice rang out from within the room. Wow! What an adorable little sister! Can I hold her? Wah! Big sister is hugging little sister, but she doesn't want to hug me. Wah! I also want to become a little sister. Parber's dejected voice also rang out within the room not long thereafter. Mag shook his head with an amused smile, clearly not envious of Trjay's current situation. Father, look! The door was opened, and Amy made her way out of the room while carefully holding a small baby that was wrapped up in layers of blankets. The little baby girl in the cocoon of blankets had a faint flush on her soft little cheeks, and she was staring up at Amy with curiosity in her large bright eyes. She reached out with a tiny little hand and strained a little to touch Amy's face, upon which an adorable smile appeared on her infantile face. She's so adorable. Amy wore a content smile on her face, then looked up at the smiling Mag with an expectant gaze, and suggested, Father, should we steal her away? Hey! Mag faltered slightly before glancing at Trjay, whose expression had suddenly changed drastically. He had finally gotten the daughter that he'd been dreaming of after overcoming many hardships, and just the thought of having her taken away was like a stab to the heart. Mag hurriedly shook his head with a smile as he said, we can't do that. This is Uncle Trjay's baby, just like you're my baby. If you steal this little sister away, Uncle Trjay will be very sad. Amy shook her head with a serious expression, and replied, that's all right, if Uncle Blue Fatty misses her, I can permit him to come and see her. This little sister can live at our house, and I'm sure she'll be super happy to taste Father's cooking every day. Trjay was just about to say something, but he was suddenly at a loss for words. Indeed, being able to live at Mamie Restaurant and taste all types of delicious dishes for free was like heaven on earth. We can't do that. Mag shook his head with a smile as he looked down at the little baby, and said, she's still too small, so she needs to be with her mother. She'll be happy to be able to eat delicious foods, but she'll be even happier if she can stay with her parents. Trjay also made his way toward them with a smile, and said, that's true. If you miss her, you can come and play with her at any time, little Amy. All right, Amy looked down at the smiling little baby in her arms, and nodded as she said, I'll let her stay with Uncle Blue Fatty, then. At this moment, Miranda made her way over to the door, and extended a grateful bow as she said, Boss Mag, thank you for saving me and my two children. There's no need to thank me. I'm just glad that both you and your children are safe and healthy, Mag replied with a smile as he shook his head. He had contributed to bringing these two little babies safely into this world, and that was quite a heartwarming experience for him. Amy held the little girl, who had been given the name Karis, and played with her until she burst into tears, upon which she was returned to Miranda to be breastfed. Amy was less than 5 years old, but due to the fact that she'd been learning melee magic from Krasua and swordsmanship from Mag, her strength was comparable to that of a normal adult even without using any magic, so it was no problem at all for her to hold a newborn. It was getting rather late, so Mag bid farewell to Trjay and Miranda before preparing to leave with Amy. Wait! Right at this moment, a rather tender voice suddenly sounded, following which Palmer suddenly made his way toward Amy. A hint of hesitation flashed through his eyes, but he still mustered up his courage in the end and handed a porcelain plate over to her as he said, "This is for you." "Hey? Isn't that Parma's favorite plate? He's always cherished it and hasn't even used it once ever since you gave it to him," Miranda exclaimed in a quiet voice. "It is. He really values that plate. I didn't think that he'd give it to little Amy." George was also quite surprised to see this. "It's a little ugly, but it matches Ugly Duckling's appearance, so I'll use it to feed Ugly Duckling." After carefully appraising the plate for a while, Amy accepted the offering from Palmer before nodding with a smile as she said, "Thanks." Mag glanced at Palmer, whose expression had stiffened slightly, and a faint smile appeared on his face. As expected, his daughter wasn't someone who could be hit on by anyone. Thus, he made his way out of the courtyard with Amy's little hand in his, and then placed her onto his bicycle. "Just you wait, big sister. I'm going to become a little sister for sure," Palmer said with a determined look on his face as he stood at the entrance. "Nonsense. You. George stared at Palmer with a resigned expression on his face. "Amy, father will teach you swordsmanship when we get home," Mag said with a smile as he rode his bicycle. Yes. I love swordsmanship." Amy nodded with an elated expression. Most of the melee magic that Krasud taught her was quite direct and violent, relying on powerful spells and unleashing sudden bursts of explosive power at close range to defeat the enemy. These battle tactics were the complete opposite of the tactics that magic casters normally employed, and during battle, they would often catch the opponent by surprise and ensure quick victory. These tactics would most likely be very effective against magic casters of the same tier, or perhaps of an even higher tier than Amy, but if she were to face a powerful knight in battle, her melee magic could prove to be a burden instead. Krasud was undoubtedly one of the most powerful beings in existence. There was virtually no one on the entire Norland continent that could directly withstand one of his ultimate fireballs, and as such, he was able to power his way through his opponent's defenses with brute force alone. However, Amy clearly wasn't powerful enough to accomplish that yet. If she could combine some battle tactics employed by knights with her melee magic, and simultaneously cultivate as both a magic caster and a knight, she would definitely become a lot more powerful than she was now. Amy was still quite young, but she was very interested in swordsmanship, and this was why Mag had decided to teach her so she could become an exceptional knight with brilliant swordsmanship. No one on the Norland continent had been able to cultivate melee magic, long-range magic, and knightly swordsmanship yet, just as no one in the history of the continent had managed to reach the 11th tier. As such, Mag was very much looking forward to seeing what kind of powerful being would culminate after combining all three of those cultivation methods. After returning to the restaurant, Mamie Restaurant took Amy to the top floor, and the two of them began to practice swordsmanship under the starry night sky. At the city lord's castle, a female employee handed a document and a black metal badge to Firis with a smile as she said, "Congratulations, Miss Firis, you've passed our background check and officially become the 820,088th resident of Chaos City. Please take good care of your residence card. That document contains your identification information. If you lose it, you can apply for a replacement at the City Lord's Castle. At the same time, the City Lord's Castle will provide you with temporary lodging and food until you find official employment." Firis looked down with a complex expression at the palm-size metal badge, upon which was inscribed her name and her identification, but she still politely expressed her gratitude toward the employee. "Thank you." "You're welcome. Is there anything else I can help you with?" the employee asked with a smile. During these past few days, she'd seen many elves who had come to Chaos City to seek refuge. Most of them were very excited after receiving their residence cards, so Firis' reaction was slightly out of the ordinary in comparison. However, it was said that this elf had been brought to Chaos City by Alex in person, and according to her self-introduction, she was Irina's servant, so her identity was rather special, which was why she received a bit more attention than others. Ferris hesitated momentarily before mustering up her courage as she asked, "Would you be able to give me a job?" Regardless of whether it was the soldiers on the city wall or the employees of the city lord's castle, all of them had treated her with benevolence and respect, which was a rather strange feeling, yet also one that was very pleasant. In the past, she had heard about Chaos City from Irina, but she had never believed that there was actually a place in this world where everyone was treated as an equal, nor would she have ever thought that she'd one day truly come to such a place and become one of its residents. After following the employee to the living quarters that she'd been assigned, Ferris looked up at the starry night sky, and thought to herself, "Is the princess doing well? She must be lonely on her own. Is he watching me from the shadows? What kind of job do I have to find to prove that I'm fit to look after the young mistress?" A series of questions flashed through her mind, leaving her feeling rather lost. In the past, all she had to worry about was serving the princess, yet now, she was suddenly having to deal with all of these issues that she'd never even had to consider before. Should I tell her? Outside the ice cream shop, Elizabeth was staring at Yabimiya, who was serving customers with a warm smile on her face. "Fox seems to be growing quite impatient, and he's summoning me back to the Dragon Islands. If I don't ever get to come back, she may never find out the truth for the rest of her life." The smile on Yabimiya's face was so clean and pure, and it wasn't forced in the slightest. This was a smile that reflected joy and bliss from the bottom of her heart. But will knowing all of this really make her happy? Elizabeth was rather hesitant with how to proceed. "She's here again?" At this point, Sally had also noticed Elizabeth's presence, and her brows furrowed slightly as she realized that Elizabeth was staring directly at Yabimiya again. Why is she so interested in Mia? Elizabeth seemed to have also sensed Sally's gaze, and their eyes met for a moment before Elizabeth strode directly into the ice cream shop. The snow and ice-themed ice cream shop was warmer than she'd expected, and even though it was already nighttime, there were still customers enjoying ice creams in the shop with blissful smiles on their faces. "Welcome. Oh, it's you." Yabimiya turned to Elizabeth with a hint of surprise on her face. She had seen this beautiful woman many times at Mamie restaurant, and Elizabeth had also asked her some strange questions in the past, so Yabimiya had quite a strong impression of her. Furthermore, perhaps it was due to the fact that this woman was a giant dragon, but Yabimiya always felt a strange sense of affection toward her. She had always been quite curious about what this strange feeling was stemming from, but she'd been holding back her curiosity this entire time. She was just a half-dragon, while Elizabeth was a noble giant dragon, and the two of them were on completely different levels. Elizabeth nodded to acknowledge Yabimiya before taking a seat beside the window. Even she didn't know why she had decided to enter the shop. "What would you like to order?" "The flavors of ice cream we have available are all listed on the menu," Yabimiya asked with a smile. "I'll get a vanilla ice cream," Elizabeth replied in a calm voice, but she had blurted out an answer, almost stumbling over her words in the process. Perhaps she really did need an ice cream just to calm herself down. "All right, please wait for a moment." Yabimiya nodded with a smile before departing, and then quickly returning with a vanilla ice cream. "Thank you," Elizabeth said before taking a lick of her ice cream. It was still the same familiar entrancing flavor, and icy sweetness of the ice cream seemed to be capable of making one forget all of their worries. The ice cream operated until 10 p.m. After the final customer departed, Yabimiya turned off the lights before leaving with Sally. It was already deep into autumn, so the nights were quite cold, and there weren't many people in the Aden Square at this time. However, there was a slender figure nearby, looking on as the two of them emerged from the shop. Yabimiya turned to Elizabeth with a slightly puzzled look as she asked, "Are you waiting for me? What do you want?" Sally stepped forward and shielded Yabimiya behind her as she appraised Elizabeth with a cautious look on her face. This wasn't the first time that Elizabeth had been observing Yabimiya, and it was very strange that a proud 7th-tier giant dragon would be constantly spying on a half-dragon restaurant waitress. I have some things I want to speak to her about. I bear no ill will, Elizabeth replied in a calm manner. Sally's eyes narrowed, and she showed no intention of stepping aside. However, Yabimiya made her way around Sally with a smile, and said, "It's okay, Aisha, she doesn't want to hurt me. You can go upstairs and go to bed now, I'll be back soon." Sally glanced at Yabimiya, and then at Elizabeth before nodding as she said, "All right, but be careful." Following Sally's departure, Yabimiya turned to Elizabeth with a smile, and asked, "Is there something you'd like to speak to me about? We're similar in age, so you don't have to refer to me in such a respectful manner." A hint of elation flashed through Yabimiya's eyes upon hearing this, but she was still rather hesitant as she asked, "Can I really do that?" Elizabeth nodded in response. Yabimiya's smile widened upon receiving this confirmation. At the sight of Yabimiya's smile, Elizabeth was feeling a lot more relaxed, but at the same time, she was becoming even more hesitant. If she were to know the truth, would she still be able to smile like that? If she were to receive the dragon origin, she'd have no choice but to be swept up into a cruel political battle. "What did you want to speak to me about?" Yabimiya asked in a curious voice. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth seemed to have something to tell her. Elizabeth returned to her senses, and calmly asked, "What kind of person do you think your father is like?" "I've never met him." Yabimiya shook her head, but her eyes quickly lit up as a smile appeared on her face, and she said, "But I heard from Mother that he's a golden armor-clad hero who can carry the entire world on his shoulders. He may be a hero, but he abandoned 2 sets of wives and daughters." Elizabeth thought to herself at the sight of Yabimiya's smiling face, but she couldn't bear to tell her that in the end. "Do you want to become a true giant dragon?" Elizabeth continued. "A giant dragon?" Yabimiya thought about this carefully before shaking her head with a smile as she said, "I once wished for that, but at the time, I thought that being a half-dragon is really abhorrent, and I even hated myself. I no longer think that now. Even as a half-dragon, I can still bring others happiness and be liked by others." Yabimiya has been referring to Elizabeth using a more respectful form of you in Chinese this entire time, but there's no real good translation for it in English, so I've kept it as you. 855 The parent's debt must be repaid by the child on the balcony of the restaurant. "Father, I'm thirsty. I'm going down to drink some water, wait for me here, I'll be back soon." Amy placed her long sword off to the side before rushing downstairs. Mag smiled as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. Sword training was one of his daily activities, and practicing every night for an hour before bed had been quite beneficial to his swordsmanship. "We've been training for close to an hour now, I'm also getting a little thirsty." Mag also placed his long sword down before heading downstairs. He was still a little worried about leaving Amy on her own, even if she had only gone to drink some water. After arriving at the bottom of the staircase, Mag was just about to walk into the room when he suddenly stopped before carefully casting his gaze toward the entrance of the restaurant. As opposed to drinking water, Amy was dragging the 2 ducks by their necks toward the entrance in a sneaky manner that Mag found to be rather amusing. At the same time, he was rather confused as he thought to himself, "What's Amy doing there?" Meow Ugly Duckling followed along behind her with an urgent and concerned look in its eyes. "Shh, be quiet, Ugly Duckling." Amy glared at Ugly Duckling before shooting a glance at the staircase as she whispered, "It'll be bad if Father catches us." Meow. Ugly Duckling gave a feeble cry before falling silent. "She doesn't want me to find out?" Mag stuck out his head again and watched as Amy made her way over to the entrance. Where was she planning to take these 2 ducks behind his back? Amy placed the 2 ducks onto the ground, and both of them began to pant heavily, having just regained the ability to breathe as Amy had released their necks. Both of them then immediately tried to get away from her, all horrified. "Stop!" Amy grabbed onto the ducks' necks again, and then got up onto the tips of her toes to reach for the door handle. After a brief struggle, she was finally able to reach the handle with her fingertips, and the door was opened. Phew! Amy exhaled before looking behind her in a guilty manner, and then glanced at the 2 failing ducks in her hands. She hurriedly released them to give them a chance to breathe, and then grabbed onto their necks again before carefully dragging them out the door. From Mag's hiding spot, he could only see a faint profile of Amy and the 2 ducks. However, they didn't go very far. Amy placed the 2 ducks down in front of the entrance, and then said something to them before a ball of flames appeared in her hand. Is she going to roast them on her own? Mag raised an eyebrow before silently making his way over to the entrance and looking outside. The 2 ducks were staring at Amy with sheer horror in their eyes. An ugly duckling hurriedly positioned itself between Amy and the 2 ducks in an urgent manner, but there was also a hint of horror in its eyes as it stared at the fireball in Amy's hand. Amy looked at the 2 red-topped tricolor ducks and slowly leaned down with an expectant look in her eyes as she murmured to herself, "These fat ugly ducks must be super delicious when roasted. They'll be just like the roast geese from that restaurant. I'll roast them until they're golden brown, then pull off a drumstick to eat, it'll be so good." Quack, quack, quack. The 2 ducks flapped their wings in a terrifying frenzy, trying to get away from this demonic little girl. However, their legs had been bound, and they'd been tied together, so they couldn't go anywhere. As such, they could only look on as the ball of fire slowly approached them, sending terrifying waves of scorching heat surging through the air. Sigh, I wanted to eat the 2 of you, but Ugly Duckling clearly doesn't want that, so I'll let you go. I can't let Ugly Duckling experience the pain of losing its parents. After heaving a faint sigh, the flames in Amy's hand were compressed to around the size of a chopstick, and she used it to slice through the ropes that had bound the 2 ducks, reducing the ropes to piles of ashes. The 2 ducks collapsed to the ground in fear as they felt a burst of scorching heat flash between their feet, and both of them wore blank expressions, seemingly yet to comprehend had just happened. In fact, they were just so frightened that they'd even forgotten to run away. "If you don't go now, I'm going to change my mind. Father is going to cook both of you into roast ducks tomorrow," Amy threatened as her eyes began to light up again. Quack, quack. Both the red-topped tricolor ducks seemed to have returned to their senses at once, and they flapped their wings as they flew toward the plaza as quickly as they could. One of them was so panicked that it almost crashed into a tree, sending a flurry of dead leaves falling onto the ground in the process before the 2 ducks vanished, turning into black spots in the distance. Meow, meow. Ugly Duckling looked on with excitement in its eyes at the sight of the 2 departing ducks, then turned toward Amy, and rubbed its little head against her foot. So she was worried that Ugly Duckling would be sad. Mag shook his head with a smile. It turned out that she was quite kind-hearted, after all. "All right, I know you're really happy." Amy stroked Ugly Duckling's head and looked at the blissful expression on its face with a smile before she suddenly asked, "But have you heard of the saying that the parent's debt must be repaid by the child?" Meow. Ugly Duckling looked up at Amy with a perplexed look in its eyes. "It's all right, you'll understand in the future." Amy picked up Ugly Duckling, and then looked up into the sky before entering the restaurant remorsefully as she murmured to herself, "It's so sad seeing these 2 roast ducks fly away. What am I going to tell Father?" He spent an entire day to catch them. Having seen all there was to be seen, Mag silently went upstairs again. Amy had clearly released the 2 ducks behind his back as she'd been worried that he wouldn't agree to let them go. However, he was rather intrigued to see what kind of excuse she would come up with to inform him of this. "Please have some water, Father." After waiting on the balcony for a while, Mag turned to discover Amy carefully making her way toward him, holding a cup of water in her hands that she was raising above her head to offer to Mag. "Thank you, Amy." Mag smiled as he accepted the cup of water before taking a sip. It appeared that she was trying to soften him up before delivering the bad news. Amy looked up at Mag with an apologetic expression on her face as she said, "I'm sorry, Father, I let the 2 ugly ducks go because I thought Ugly Duckling would be sad." "That's all right. It's a good thing that you're considerate of your friend's feelings." Mag shook his head with a smile as he looked at Amy with approval in his eyes. Not only was she learning to be considerate of the feelings of others, more importantly, she hadn't tried to tell a lie. It was very important to him that Amy had chosen to be honest in this situation. A smile appeared on Amy's face as she nodded, and said, "But it's all right, even though I let them go, we still have their child, so they'll have to come back sooner or later." Mag gave a slightly resigned smile as he patted Amy's head, and said, "Let's practice for a bit longer, then go to bed." "All right." Amy nodded before picking up her long sword before imitating Mag as practice resumed. The next morning, Mag had just finished making everyone's breakfasts when Yabimiya greeted him outside the restaurant, and asked, "Boss, what's this stinky tofu?" 856. Is it that bad? Amy, Sally, and the others were also all looking at Mag with curiosity in their eyes. The new dish hadn't been prepared for breakfast this morning, so all of them were wondering just what this new stinky tofu dish was. "Is it tofu pudding that smells bad?" Amy asked. "Is it when you remove the brains from tofu one, then make it stinky?" Babla also chimed in with an inquisitive look on her face. "Is it actually stinky?" Sally asked in a rather concerned manner. As an elf, she had a mild case of mysophobia. "How do I put this?" Mag thought to himself as he looked at everyone's intrigued expressions. Stinky tofu was a very contentious and controversial dish. Those who loved it treated it like a prized treasure, while those who didn't avoided it like the plague. Mag had once been one of the people that belonged to the latter group. There were some misunderstandings involved there, but if it weren't for the fact that he'd been forced to bask in the putrid aroma of stinky tofu in the test field for the god of cookery for so long, he most likely still wouldn't have been able to accept its stinky odor. However, after making a portion of the perfect stinky tofu, Mag had completely changed his mind. Stinky tofu was a very prevalent and renowned dish, and there had to be a reason for this. Mag contemplated his answer for a moment before replying, "This is a dish with a distinctive and pronounced flavor. It's very stinky, but if you were to carefully pick apart its aroma, you'd find that it has a rich and unique fragrance. After tasting it, you'll realize that it's an irresistibly delicious dish. It may not suit everyone's tastes, but those who like it will love it. However, it's not very suitable to be consumed for breakfast, so I didn't make it for you. I want to eat it. I want to eat it." Amy raised a little hand high up into the air as she yelled, "I can only smell the rich and unique aroma. I really want to eat stinky tofu." A gentle and doting look appeared in Mag's eyes as he looked at Amy's expectant expression. He then turned to everyone else, and asked, "Does anyone else want to try it? Before you make your decision, I must warn that the flavor of this dish is quite heavy, and those who are sensitive to foul odors should exercise discretion before deciding whether to try it or not." "I'll pass." Sally immediately shook her head. "I'll pass as well." Babla also shook her head. She liked things that smelled good, and she couldn't accept foul-smelling foods. "See, can I try it?" Yabimiya asked in a cautious and feeble voice as if she were worried that she'd made the wrong decision. "All right, so that's 2 portions of stinky tofu. I'll make them separately for the 2 of you after breakfast." Mag nodded with a smile. A dish with such an overpowering flavor should be eaten at the end of a meal. Furthermore, there was no guarantee that the 2 of them would still have the appetite for breakfast if they were to eat stinky tofu first. After breakfast, Mag entered the kitchen to make stinky tofu. Amy and Yabimiya were looking at Mag through the entrance of the kitchen with expectant expressions on their faces, while Sally and Babla were standing slightly further away, casting their eyes toward the kitchen with slightly wary expressions. "System, activate the molecular isolation system. Isolate the area where stinky tofu is made from the rest of the kitchen, and also isolate all of the individual tables in the restaurant," Mag instructed internally, and then removed the lid of the brine jar after receiving an affirmative response from the system. An overpowering stinky odor immediately wafted through the air. However, Mag was a true man who had even drunk this brine before, and he'd also spent dozens of days embroiled in this very same odor in the test field for the god of cookery. As such, he was instantly able to pinpoint the unique fragrance of the brine before inhaling deeply in an intoxicated manner. Among the pieces of tofu that he'd placed into the jug this morning, he pulled out around a dozen to find that they'd already turned black. He rinsed them under cold water before setting them off to the side to be dried. After that, he poured a large amount of camellia oil into a pot and heated it up until it took on a red color, and then placed the pieces of tofu into the pot. The tofu was deep fried for 5 minutes over low heat, and when the surface of the pieces of tofu had taken on a golden brown hue, he removed them from the oil before placing them on plates. He then poked a hole into the center of each piece of stinky tofu with a chopstick, and used a small spoon to scoop some chili oil, soy sauce, and sesame seed oil into those indentations. After that, he sprinkled some minced garlic and coriander over the dish before pouring a ladle of secret sauce over each plate of stinky tofu, and the dish was complete. "Why can't I smell anything? It doesn't smell good, and it's not stinky, either," Amy said with a curious look on her face as she outside the entrance of the kitchen. "I can't smell anything, either." Yabimiya also wore a perplexed look on her face. Mag had made it sound like this dish was extremely putrid, and she'd also changed her mind about tasting it as a result. However, it appeared to almost be complete now, but she still couldn't smell anything. That was really strange. "I set up a magic formation in the kitchen, as well as the entire restaurant, that can isolate aromas. That way, the aromas of the dishes in the restaurant won't intermingle with one another, and customers will be able to enjoy their dishes without being affected by the aroma in the air," Mag explained as he loaded 2 portions of stinky tofu onto 2 platters, and then placed a dome-shaped metal cover over each plate. He then emerged from the kitchen with a smile, and said, "Take a seat." Amy and Yabimiya immediately sat down at the table closest to the entrance to the kitchen, and then stared at the platters in Mag's hands with expectant looks in their eyes. Sally and Babla also made their way over to the table. According to what Mag was saying, the aroma of the dishes should be restricted to the scope of the table, so they didn't have to worry about smelling the dish. Even if your first impression of the dish is that it's unbearably stinky, you have to repress the urge to give up on it. After a while, your impression of it might change, Mag said as he placed the platters down onto the table, and then removed their lids. A rich stinky aroma immediately wafted through the air, and Yabimiya almost reflexively jumped up from her seat. Her dragon tail immediately appeared, flinging her chair over in the process. This abhorrent odor had dealt her a very heavy blow. She had worked in damp and dark kitchens for many years, and during that time, she'd been forced by her employers to take care of countless rotten ingredients and dishes, and even been assigned the duty of unclogging underground sewage pipes. However, none of those horrific odors could compare with what she was smelling right now. If it weren't for Mag's earlier warning, she would have already rushed out the door to desperately gulp down some fresh air. "Is it that bad?" Sally and Babla were both given a fright by Yabimiya's reaction, and at the same time, they were quite glad that they'd chosen not to sample the dish. This reaction was far more violent than when Yabimiya was eating Rugiamos, and she'd taken on her half-dragon form uncontrollably in the blink of an eye. Just how putrid did this dish have to be to draw such a reaction from her? In contrast, Amy was staring at the dish before her with an entranced look on her face as if she couldn't smell its abhorrent odor at all. Instead, she picked up her chopsticks as if she were about to dig into an extremely delicious dish. Everyone then cast their eyes toward the pieces of black tofu, which had been placed on long rectangular plates. Their centers were filled with condiments, and their surface was covered in rich brown sauce, as well as pieces of coriander, thereby creating a rather alluring sight to behold. "Is something that stinky really edible?" The same question flashed through Sally's and Babla's mind at the same time. Amy carefully picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks, making sure that not even a single shred of coriander fell from it, before taking a bite. After biting through the crispy exterior, the spicy and supple sauces created a delicious explosion of flavor in her mouth. Amy's eyes immediately narrowed in a blissful smile, and after swallowing her first mouthful of tofu, she stuck out her little tongue to lick the sauce around her lips, and then ate the remaining portion of that piece of stinky tofu in a single bite. Once again, another play on words where the Chinese characters for tofu pudding literally translates to tofu brains, hence the reference for removing the brains. 857 Its stinkiness is just a ruse. Gulp. Everyone swallowed in unison at the sight of Amy's blissful expression. They knew that this stinky tofu was astonishingly putrid, but they still couldn't help but try to imagine its delicious flavor as they looked at Amy's joyful reaction. Amy made everything she ate look extremely delicious, but even Sally and Babla were quite curious about just what this abhorrent stinky tofu could taste like. Yabimiya was just about to run away when a hint of surprise also suddenly flashed through her eyes. Her agitated dragon tail settled down, and she closed her eyes as she carefully inhaled the aroma wafting through the air. This is not just a purely stinky aroma, I can smell a special fragrance hidden deep within it. The more I delve into that special aroma, the more pronounced it becomes, and it's very warm and mild, making me want to explore it even further. After a brief hesitation, Yabimiya sat back down in her seat before appraising the stinky tofu dish before her. Just like all of the dishes that Mag had made in the past, this stinky tofu was very appetizing in appearance. The black tofu didn't appear to be hideous in the slightest, and after being stuffed with condiments and drizzled with that rich brown sauce, it appeared to be very alluring instead. The overwhelmingly putrid aroma had already transformed into a rich and unique fragrance that was extremely captivating. What will this dish taste like? Yabimiya glanced at the blissful Amy beside her, and then also picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks. The black exterior of the tofu had been fried to a slightly yellow tinge, and its center was stuffed full with condiments. The green coriander that had been sprinkled all over the dish provided a perfect finishing touch that gave the dish a refreshing appearance. The best way to eat stinky tofu is to eat an entire piece per mouthful, Mag suggested with a smile. One piece at a time? Yabimiya looked down at the piece of tofu between her chopsticks, only to find that it was just the right size for an adult mouthful, but it most likely wouldn't be very elegant to eat an entire piece in one mouthful. After some brief hesitation, Yabimiya still placed the entire piece of stinky tofu into her mouth before biting down on it. The spicy juices encapsulated within the stinky tofu instantly flourished within her mouth, and for a split second, her mind went completely blank. Her body's first reaction was to spit out the stinky tofu right away. However, she then discovered that there was an unimaginably delicious flavor intermingled with the intense spiciness. Beyond the crispy exterior was an extremely soft and smooth tofu interior, and the spicy juices instantly made all of her taste buds come alive. The abundance of condiments and also presented her with a diverse variety of textures, and she felt as if a delicious pot of warm soup were bubbling within her mouth. Rib. 2 buttons immediately flew off the front of her maid uniform, revealing a section of her fair and alluring cleavage. Even so, she still couldn't bear to spit out the stinky tofu in her mouth. She raised her head upward as she panted with her mouth open, and her cheeks were bulging, but she no longer had any spare capacity to worry about her appearance. The stinky tofu was extremely hot, but far too delicious for her to bear spitting it out. The scorching temperature in her mouth quickly receded along with the spicy flavor, but another unique and delicious flavor instantly flourished to take its place. This was an extraordinary dish that had the crispiness and fragrance of deep-fried tofu, and its interior was only slightly firmer than tofu pudding, but it was so delicious and refreshing. On top of that, the condiments and secondary ingredients gave the dish a soul, and made it absolutely irresistible. After swallowing her first mouthful of stinky tofu, Yabimiya's eyes remained closed for a long while. All of the stinkiness had vanished, and a rich intoxicating fragrance lingered in her mouth as well as in the surrounding area. This fragrance filled every single nook and cranny in the air around her, and she felt as if she'd been completely enchanted. Only after a long while did Yabimiya open her mouth, and as soon as she did so, she exclaimed, "This is too delicious." Words fail to describe this delicious flavor. This is something that you'll never forget after eating it once. In particular, when the flavor first flourished inside my mouth, that was an incredible feeling. A smile appeared on Mag's face upon seeing this. The aroma of stinky tofu had been unforgettable to him, even though he'd never eaten it in his past life, so of course it was even more unforgettable for those who'd actually tasted it. It appeared that the dish that he'd made certainly lived up to stinky tofu's lofty reputation. His gaze then lingered for a moment on Yabimiya's chest. It appeared that it was time to make a slightly larger uniform for her. This type of fan service was way too much for him. Is it really that good? Sally and Babla were both quite intrigued, even though it was very difficult for them to imagine that such a foul-smelling dish could be so delicious. However, Yabimiya didn't continue in her description. Instead, she picked up another piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks before placing it in her mouth like a devout believer. She immediately fell into the hot and spicy trap again, having to pant to alleviate the heat, and then swallow the mouthful of tofu at the most perfect moment. This was a very special experience, and it would be a completely different culinary experience if one were to taste the dish after it had cooled. Inside the restaurant, Amy and Yabimiya sat across one another with blissful expressions on their faces while enjoying their stinky tofu. Meanwhile, Mag, Sally, and Babla looked on in silence from outside the molecular isolation barrier. "Do you want to try it?" Mag asked the two of them with a smile. No, Sally still shook her head in a firm manner. However, Babla's expression had become rather hesitant. She'd already lost count of the number of times that she'd had to surreptitiously gulp down her own drool, and she knew that she might not be able to handle the abhorrent aroma of the dish, but she still couldn't help but be tempted at the sight of Amy and Yabimiya's blissful expressions. It was as if there were a demon sitting on her shoulder, constantly trying to goad her into trying the dish for herself. She was a princess who had to have fresh fragrant flowers placed in her living room every day, and she'd always avoided foul-smelling objects, but in that instant, she was really tempted to sample this dish. "Big Sister Babla, even though my stinky tofu is super delicious, I can let you taste a piece." Amy picked up a piece of tofu with her chopsticks before turning to Babla with a smile on her face. A drop of rich sauce dripped down onto her plate from the piece of tofu, and at that moment, the black and putrid piece of tofu was so alluring in Babla's eyes that it was as if a golden halo had appeared around it. Gulp! Babla swallowed another mouthful of drool, and she'd even taken a small step forward before she'd realized it. However, she stopped just before she was about to step into the isolated space, and she crossed her arms with a determined look on her face as she said, "I definitely won't eat any stinky foods. This is a truly delicious dish. Its stinkiness is just a ruse." Amy shook her head as she moved her chopsticks closer to Babla's mouth, and then smiled as she said, "It really is super delicious." A rich aroma immediately wafted toward her, and it was so strong that for a split second, she couldn't even tell whether it smelled good or not. However, one thing was for sure, this was definitely an aroma that she wanted to run away from. However, just as Babla was about to refuse again, her mouth suddenly opened and accepted the piece of stinky tofu, almost against her will. 858 Is it that serious? It's so good. A tsunami of deliciousness was crashing into Babla's soul, making her entire being tremor with bliss. The incredible sensation culminated in those three simple words that served as the most truthful representation of her feelings at that very moment. After swallowing the mouthful of stinky tofu, a rich aroma continued to linger in her mouth, and Babla licked the sauce from around the lips as she exhaled with elation. Everyone was looking at her with amused expressions on their faces. In the face of truly delicious food, none of her vows or declarations could repress her innermost desires. Sally had already retreated to 2 tables further away, but she also wore an amused smile on her face. Babla immediately blushed from the widespread scrutiny that she was receiving, and she wanted to burrow into the ground to hide her shame. But this stinky tofu dish was simply far too delicious. Within just that small piece of tofu was such a rich and diverse profile of flavors. The hot juices within her mouth and on the tip of her tongue completely intoxicated her, and she couldn't help but turn her attention to Amy and Yabimiya's plates, each of which only had one piece of stinky tofu left. "This one's for me." Amy picked up the final piece of stinky tofu on her plate with her chopsticks, and then placed it in her mouth with a blissful smile on her face. Babla turned her gaze away from Amy's plate in a reluctant manner before turning to Mag. Mag glanced at the clock on the wall before smiling as he shook his head, and said, "If you want some more, then you'll have to wait until after the breakfast service. I have to take Amy to her morning lessons now." Babla cast her gaze down toward the two empty plates with a dejected sigh. After that, Amy and Yabimiya picked their plates and licked the juices clean. Even then, they still looked like they were left wanting more. "Take a short break, then prepare to welcome the customers," Mag said with a smile before dabbing at Amy's mouth with a napkin, and then pushing the bicycle out the door. The system's molecular isolation system had indeed proven to be very effective. It was able to isolate the aromas within a certain space, and it also had an air cleansing effect that made sure all of the aromas had been cleared out for the next customer. This aroma isolation system is so extraordinary. The smell of the stinky tofu hasn't spread to the rest of the restaurant at all, and even within this area, the aroma has completely disappeared. Yabimiya said with a hint of amazement in her eyes as she cleared the table. Babla also tried walking into the area, and then inhaling deeply, only to find that she felt as if she were standing in a forest that was filled with fresh air, and the aroma of the stinky tofu had completely vanished. "What kind of spell formation is this, and why have I never heard of it before? Could it be that the magic has been developed to such an incredible extent on this continent already?" Babla thought to herself with furrowed brows and a hint of bewilderment in her heart. During this time, she had read many books detailing the history of the Norland continent, thereby developing a certain level of understanding of this world. In the books of the Moon Nation, very rarely did the term Norland continent appear, and she had only seen the term once on a coverless ancient tome in her father's study. The tome had been sealed by magic, and she could only flip open the first page, which only contained a short excerpt that gave an extremely brief description of the Norland continent. At the time, she had only been intrigued that there was a continent outside of the Moon Nation, and never would she have thought that she'd end up there one day. What kind of connection is there between the Norland continent and the Moon Nation? What is that ancient tome sealed in Father's study about? Why is it that there's an ancient teleportation formation in the royal palace of the Moon Nation that leads to the Norland continent? A series of questions weighed heavily on her heart, and she pored over countless books to try and find the answer. Even though she couldn't find an exact answer, she was able to ascertain one thing: the history of the Moon Nation and the Norland continent overlapped for a period of time in the distant past. It wasn't a coincidence, the events that had taken place in those two parallel stretches of history were completely identical. The historical records of the two lands during that time were almost exactly the same, so there had to be some kind of special connection there. What she wanted to do was to figure out what this connection was before she returned to the Moon Nation. Even though there wasn't much of a difference in the military strength of the two worlds, the usage of magic in the Moon Nation was clearly more advanced. Magic casters of the Moon Nation were able to use magic to create some things that could increase efficiency in daily tasks as opposed to using them solely in battle. However, this firm belief in her heart had been completely flipped on its head by this molecular isolation system. This was an extraordinary spell formation that could isolate aromas and cleanse the air in small areas. As a 7th-tier spatial magic caster, she could repair an ancient teleportation formation on her own, and her talent in the area of spell formations had received glowing praise from her royal instructor. However, even she was completely unable to comprehend how a spell formation like this could have possibly been set up. When Mag returned after dropping off Amy, a long line had already gathered in front of the restaurant. The regular customers all greeted Mag, and Mag also smiled as he responded in kind. He was able to remember the names or nicknames of all of the customers who had introduced themselves to him in the past, so his greetings always made one feel very comfortable and appreciated. "Boss Mag, I heard you're releasing a new dish. What is this stinky tofu? Is it actually stinky? Does it have something to do with tofu pudding?" Harrison asked. All of the other customers also instantly fell silent as they turned toward Mag for an answer. This was a question that they all wanted to ask. Stinky tofu isn't stinky tofu pudding, but it does have quite a strong flavor. I'd advise those who can't stand foul odors or are misophobic to exercise caution before ordering the dish. At the same time, due to the special nature of stinky tofu, I'd like everyone to decide whether you'd like to order the dish before entering the restaurant so my staff can do their best to seat all customers wishing to try the dish at the same tables. In doing so, we'll be sparing the other customers from the strong aroma of the dish, Mag said with a smile as his gaze lingered momentarily on Elizabeth, who was the third in line. He hadn't thought that she would come to line up in front of his restaurant early in the morning. Is it that serious? All of the customers were rather surprised to hear this. Everyone was very excited that Mamie Restaurant was releasing a new dish, and they'd all come to line up very early. If it weren't for the limited catering capacity of the restaurant, the line outside could easily be twice as long as it currently was. However, everyone knew how Mag liked to do things, and the fact that he was issuing this warning and even organizing designated tables for customers wishing to order stinky tofu was making people rather uneasy. Some of the customers who had been determined to taste the dish were growing rather hesitant. If it actually stinks, won't that make the restaurant stink as well? Elizabeth's brows furrowed slightly. As for what it tastes like, you'll know when you taste it. Mag opened the restaurant doors with a smile, and said, "Welcome." 859 Whoa! The customers at the front of the line made their way into the restaurant with mixed emotions, but they didn't immediately take their seats, as they were still rather hesitant about how to proceed. Those who wish to order stinky tofu can take a seat at one of the tables on the far left of the restaurant over there, the rest of you can sit wherever you like. Aside from today, stinky tofu will only be served during dinner service, and only 100 portions will be served each day, so it's going to be a first-come, first-served arrangement, Mag said with a smile. The customers who had decided not to try the stinky tofu quickly took their seats, while the rest were still rather hesitant. Mag had given them quite a serious warning, but at the same time, his new dishes had never flopped before. If it really were both stinky and disgusting to eat, there was no way that he'd serve it in his restaurant. "Hello, Miss Elizabeth," Yabimiya greeted Elizabeth with a hint of surprise and elation on her face. Seeing as she was about to take a seat on the right side, she couldn't help but urge in a quiet voice, "Stinky tofu is super delicious, I strongly recommend it." Elizabeth was rather taken aback upon hearing this, but after seeing the sincerity in Yabimiya's eyes, she chose to sit on the far left side of the restaurant after some brief hesitation. "There's someone actually willing to try the dish." Elizabeth's actions immediately attracted a lot of attention. Not only was she the first customer to have taken a seat on the far left, she was also an icy beauty. Mag also cast a surprised glance at Elizabeth. Could she really handle such a foul odor? On top of that, she seemed to have changed her mind after Yabimiya had said something to her. Were they that familiar with each other already? Seeing as someone had led the way, many of the indecisive customers also made up their minds and sat on the far left. Harrison sat down across from Elizabeth before giving her a polite and reserved smile. He was just a normal human being, but as a merchant, he had a sharp discerning eye, and he knew that despite this woman's alluring beauty, she was not someone that he could mess with. She was the type of woman that would kill someone for doing anything that was even slightly over the line to her. If it weren't for the fact that there were no seats left on the far left side of the restaurant, he really wouldn't want to sit here. Sitting beside Elizabeth was Zixi, while Lulu sat across her. "Hello," Zixi greeted Elizabeth and Harrison with a smile as soon as she sat down. She then took a deep breath, and said, "Thank heavens we managed to get the last 2 seats. I can't believe there are people who are actually hesitating about trying out Boss Mag's new dish." "Hello to you too," Harrison replied with a smile. As a regular customer of the restaurant, he was quite familiar with this couple, and their arrival at this table instantly made him feel a lot more relaxed. "Hello," Elizabeth also replied with a slight nod. Her gaze then lingered on Zixi and Lulu for a moment before she looked away. These two weren't humans, but they weren't elves, either, and she was struggling to identify them. As a proud giant dragon, Elizabeth had never shared a table with humans before, but ever since she'd begun coming to Mamie Restaurant, she found herself regularly having to share tables with humans, elves, and even demons. This restaurant seemed to have a mystical atmosphere that made all customers completely absorbed in the food they were eating, thereby forgetting all of their racial disparities and preconceived biases. In their eyes, only their food existed, and they didn't care with whom they were sharing a table. "I'll get a sweet tofu pudding, a young Joe fried rice, and," Elizabeth looked up at Yabimiya, and said, "a stinky tofu." All of the customers began to make their orders while Mag entered the kitchen and began cooking. "Boss, should we go and taste Boss Mag's new dish?" Keel asked in an excited manner as he stood outside the restaurant. "Isn't it stinky?" "I hate stuff that stinks, so I'll pass," Mond replied with a shake of his head. "Let's look at the price first. The third group of our brethren is already on their way, and we have to prepare enough holy Rugiamos for them. If we were to buy this new dish, it could mean that we wouldn't have enough money to buy holy Rugiamos," SAHDR said with a cautious shake of his head. At this moment, a customer beside them opened the menu, and said, "Stinky tofu is 300 copper coins per portion, just like Rugiamo. We're buying holy Rugiamos instead." SAHDR immediately decided upon hearing that. "I concur." Keel raised a hand with a serious look on his face. Everyone else in the Burning Legion also nodded in agreement. Most of the customers behind them in the line also decided against ordering this new dish. 300 copper coins wasn't much, but if this stinky tofu really was abhorrently putrid and ruined their mood for the entire day, it would simply not be worth it. Elizabeth's young Joe fried rice and tofu pudding were brought to her first, but the stinky tofu was held back. Only after she'd finished both dishes did Yabimiya carefully carry a platter with a metal lid toward her. All of the customers immediately turned their attention to the platter, craning their necks to see just what this stinky tofu looked like and whether it was actually as foul as Mag had made it sound. However, the metal lid covered everything, making impossible for them to see the dish. "Here's your stinky tofu," Yabimiya said with a smile as she set the platter down before Elizabeth, and then grabbed onto the handle of the lid. Harrison drew back reflexively upon seeing this. He was feeling rather uneasy. He'd just had all this delicious food, and his happiness meter had spiked. If his mood were to be ruined by this dish, then that would be quite a travesty. In contrast, Zixi drew closer to Elizabeth with a glowing expectant look in her eyes as she stared at the platter. She was a devout foodie who was determined to taste all the delicious cuisine across the entire continent even while running for her life. As long as the food tasted good, she didn't care what it smelled like. "I didn't think there would really be people who want to eat stinky food in this world. Indeed. I have great confidence in Boss Mag, but I just can't imagine myself liking a stinky dish. I'm a bit worried about whether the foul odor will spread to us and ruin our appetite after that lid is lifted." All of the customers were discussing quietly among themselves, and some of the customers who were still eating were growing rather concerned. Elizabeth's expression remained quite calm, and she seemed to be unconcerned, but there was an unmistakable hint of apprehension in her eyes. She looked up at Yabimiya, and thought to herself, "She says it's good, so it must be quite delicious, and it's probably not going to smell all that bad." Yabimiya gripped onto the handle of the lid, and then lifted it with a smile on her face. An abhorrent odor immediately wafted through the air in all directions. "Whoa!" Harrison sprang out of this chair and jumped back 2 meters, almost crashing into the table behind him as a result. The bashful smile on Lulu's face vanished, and he reared back reflexively, causing his chair to creak and groan as if it were about to fall apart. Even the expectant Zixi immediately pinched her nose as her anticipation turned to shock and disgust. "What?" Elizabeth's calm facade completely shattered, and a wall of ice instantly rose up before her to cut her off from the table. 860 Completely defenseless. Everyone in the restaurant was waiting to see the new dish, but the reactions of the customers sitting at that table came as quite a surprise. What kind of putrid odor could make a fatso spring back 2 meters out of his chair and force a giant dragon to conjure up a wall of ice? Even the customers on the neighboring tables were reflexively leaning away, trying to get further away from that table in case they were also afflicted by the abhorrent odor. Mamie Restaurant's new dishes always drew resoundingly positive reactions, but on this occasion, everyone looked as if they wanted to flee for their lives. Is it that bad? Mag thought to himself as he looked at the slightly chaotic restaurant. He'd already gotten Amy and Yabimiya to try the dish this morning, but it appeared that he'd still underestimated the impact the aroma of the dish was going to have. He was even beginning to regret not opening the curtains during breakfast. Otherwise, he could get Amy to eat the dish behind the floor-to-ceiling window, and there would have been no need for him to advertise the dish. Amy's reaction alone would have had customers scrambling to order stinky tofu like moths to a flame. I'm willing to bet that no one can eat this stinky tofu. This smells way too horrible. It's like, Harrison stared at the stinky tofu on the table with a hint of fear in his eyes, and he was at a loss for an apt analogy. In the end, he announced, there's no way anyone can eat this. If anyone does, I'll run a lap around the Aiden Square in the nude. Thus, everyone was even more convinced that this dish was truly as abhorrent as Mag had warned it would be. After all, this was a testimonial from a direct witness, so it had a very high level of credibility. Those who had decided against ordering stinky tofu all smiled as they commended themselves for their wise decision, while the customers on the far left were wondering whether they should refrain from ordering the dish or cancel the orders for stinky tofu they'd already made. At this moment, a customer exclaimed, "Wait, why can't we smell anything? Come to think of it, it seems like the aromas of the dishes on this table can't be smelled as soon as we leave this area." All of the other customers also began looking around upon hearing this. Many of them had already sensed that the restaurant seemed to be different today somehow, but they couldn't put a finger on just what was different about it. Now that the stinky tofu had been brought out, everyone discovered that its odor had been limited to just that table alone, while no one else in the restaurant was able to smell anything. It was as if the aromas had been cut off by invisible walls that were undetectable even to powerful magic casters. This discovery filled everyone with a sense of amazement. Of course, they were much more relieved than they were amazed. If the aromas had been isolated, then no one would have to worry about their appetite being ruined. Boss Mag really was a thoughtful restaurant owner who was always looking out for his customers. What if she doesn't eat the dish? Does that mean Boss Mag's new dish will be a flop? A customer asked in a quiet voice. Everyone's attention was drawn back to the stinky tofu before Elizabeth again. The black stinky tofu had been embellished with a pinch of green coriander and placed on a decorated long dish in an orderly manner. The rich brown sauce that had been drizzled over the dish also served to make it appear even more alluring. If it weren't for the putrid aroma emanating from the dish, it would be quite enticing to everyone. However, after smelling the aroma in person, Harrison was willing to make a bet with such high stakes, proclaiming he would streak around the Aiden Square if someone were to eat the dish. As such, most of the customers had already decided that they wouldn't be ordering this dish. Boss Mag was a genius who had created one incredible dish after another. His unique cooking methods and brilliant ingredient combinations culminated in delicious, revolutionary dishes, but even geniuses could make mistakes, so this was quite understandable. "I'm already beginning to look forward to the next new dish," a customer said with a smile before scooping a spoonful of fried rice into his mouth. Many customers were still looking at Elizabeth, wanting to see just how she was going to react. Ever since Mamie Restaurant had been opened, no one had ever been dissatisfied with the taste of the dishes that had been served. However, having conjured up that wall of ice, it didn't appear Elizabeth was going to eat the stinky tofu no matter what. "But it's really good. It's super delicious," Yabimiya thought to herself in an urgent manner. The stinky tofu was so good, yet it was being completely misunderstood. She had found it to be unbearable as well prior to tasting it, but after sampling the dish, she'd fallen hopelessly in love with its flavor. However, these customers were going to turn their backs on this dish based on the smell alone. All of Mag's effort in inventing this new dish was going to go to waste. Elizabeth furrowed her brows as she sat behind her wall of ice. For an instant, she'd almost reverted back to her dragon form, such was the shock inflicted on her by the abhorrent aroma of this dish. She had never smelled something so terrible in her life, and she'd been caught completely off guard. Frost dragons were the most mysophobic among all dragons. The Frost Island was covered in ice all year round, so there were no visible impurities nor any strange and putrid odors on the island. All of the food they ate also bore no strange aromas whatsoever. As such, this stinky tofu dish had completely exceeded her tolerance range. If it weren't for the fact that Yabimiya were standing right beside her, she would have stormed out of the restaurant already. "This stinky tofu," Elizabeth began in a slightly dark voice. "It's not actually stinky, it's just an extremely rich fragrant aroma, and it only stinks because the aroma is overly rich. If you carefully delve into the aroma, you'll find that it contains no impurities whatsoever, and that it's extremely alluring." Yabimiya cut her off in an urgent manner as she looked at Elizabeth with sincerity and a hint of hope in her eyes. There were many regular customers in the restaurant, but in that moment, Yabimiya chose to place her trust in Elizabeth, the cold and aloof frost dragon who would always come to the restaurant alone and ask her some strange questions from time to time. Elizabeth was already preparing to reject this dish, but at the sight of Yabimiya's earnest and beseeching gaze, she hesitated momentarily before appraising the stinky tofu before her again. Behind the wall of ice, the aroma had been hampered significantly, and it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been when the lid on the dish had first been lifted. Setting aside her first impression of the dish, she discovered that there really were traces of a more fragrant aroma that lay beyond the foul odor. As she began to focus on that unique fragrance, it slowly became richer and richer, and as opposed to being unpleasant, it became rather alluring instead. Elizabeth's furrowed brows gradually smoothed out. Ding! The wall of ice was shattered and vanished. Thus, the aroma that had been restricted wafted toward her again in full force. However, she didn't conjure up another wall of ice this time. Instead, she closed her eyes to truly experience the aroma. In doing so, she discovered that it was indeed fragrant to the extreme rather than putrid. The entire restaurant had already fallen silent as all of the customers stared at Elizabeth with bewilderment in their eyes. They clearly didn't expect her to withdraw the wall of ice and directly face that unbearable odor. "What is she doing?" Harrison murmured to himself in a perplexed manner. Elizabeth opened her eyes, and then plucked a piece of stinky tofu into her mouth with her chopsticks. 861 UVE ruined me, Boss Mag. She bit through the piece of stinky tofu, and the juices within it immediately flourished in her mouth as an explosion of heat and spiciness. Hot! In that instant, that was the only word that flashed through her mind. Rib! At the same time, the sound of fabric being torn rang out as the collar of her dress split open. What lay beyond that part of her dress was something that only she knew of. Mag raised an eyebrow upon seeing this. This woman appeared to be quite thin and frail, but her chest was quite sizable indeed. In that respect, she was rather like Mia. Could it be that this was a common trait among all women with giant dragon bloodlines? A layer of faint icy mist rose up around Elizabeth as her body's first reaction was to lower her temperature. However, as the cool mist was about to reach her oral cavity, she prevented it from doing so. She couldn't bear to part with this scorching hot feeling. The hot and spicy juices had set all of her taste buds into an elated frenzy, and the diverse variety of condiments created an incredible flavor. Beneath the crispy and fragrant skin was an extremely soft and smooth tofu center, creating a huge contrast. Elizabeth panted as she opened her mouth, trying to dispel some of the heat in the simplest way possible while still carefully savoring the delicious flavor that had blossomed in her mouth. The rich aroma in the air complemented the delicious flavor on her tongue, and she could no longer smell anything abhorrent from this dish. Instead, this aroma had become impossibly intoxicating to her. She felt as if she could see a piece of tofu pudding being deep-fried in a pot of oil and then filled with all types of condiments before being drizzled by a ladle of scorching hot sauce. The incredible imagery was the perfect accompaniment to this incredible flavor. After swallowing her first piece of tofu, the delicious flavor lingered in her mouth, and her stomach was rejoicing. She ate it. All of the customers stared at Elizabeth with astonished eyes. She had reacted so violently to the putrid odor, yet she had just eaten an entire piece of stinky tofu in what appeared to be an extremely enjoyable manner. Gulp, a woman swallowed involuntarily as she murmured, "Am I the only one who thinks that looks super delicious?" "I also think the same," someone beside her chimed in with a nod. How is this possible? I can't even stand this horrible odor. How can she eat something like this and look so happy while doing it? Harrison's eyes were about to bulge out of their sockets. When has Boss Mag's food ever disappointed us? You should go streak in the square now, George chuckled with a hint of gloating joy in his eyes. Harrison's expression immediately fell, and he was kicking himself for making such a stupid bet. What was he supposed to do now? After the blissful smile lingered on her face for a while, Elizabeth returned to her senses and discovered the torn front of her dress, upon which a faint blush appeared on her face. She raised a hand to her chest, and her torn dress sealed itself again. However, her corset had also split open, and she'd have to change to a new one. All she could now was temporarily seal it together with ice. Did it taste good? Yabimiya asked with a hopeful look on her face. It was very delicious. Elizabeth nodded in response. If it weren't for Yabimiya's insistence, she would have most likely missed out on this delicious dish. After all, she had zero tolerance to foul odors. That's great. An elated smile appeared on Yabimiya's face. This was an extremely important testimonial. Without saying anything else, Elizabeth picked up another piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks before placing it in her mouth, and then continuing to bask in its unique delicious flavor. Zixi had also stopped pinching her own nose, and she was staring at the stinky tofu before Elizabeth with a hint of yearning in her eyes. It really is a fragrant aroma. It's just that the aroma is so strong and rich that it comes across as stinky when you first catch a whiff of it. Now that I really try to delve into the aroma, I can smell an extremely alluring underlying scent. We'll get 2 stinky tofus, Lulu said to Yabimiya. Coming right up. Yabimiya nodded with a smile. I also want a stinky tofu. I'll get 2, one for now, and the other for takeaway. All of the customers who had already planned to give up on the dish were suddenly scrambling to make their orders in case they missed out on it. All of the regular customers of Mamie restaurant were devout foodies. After all, having to line up for close to an hour at a time for a meal wasn't something that everyone could endure. As such, as long as the dish tasted good, what did it matter that it stank? On top of that, it was actually simply overly rich in aroma rather than stinky, so it was certainly nothing to fear. Of course, there were still many customers who decided against trying out the dish. Regardless of what other people said, the fact of the matter was that it stank, even if the stench was arising from an overly rich fragrance. It was not that easy for customers to overcome this mental hurdle. When are you going to streak, Harrison? Make sure to notify us beforehand so we can go and spectate, one of the customers asked with a smile. Please do notify us, and I'll make sure I don't go out for that entire day. I'd rather not see something so traumatizing, a young woman chimed in with amusement in her eyes. All of the other customers also burst into laughter. These regular customers of Mamie restaurant met each other virtually every day, so it was fine for them to make jokes at the expense of other regular customers from time to time. Well, you see, I think I'll need to try out this dish for myself to see if it actually tastes good, Harrison mumbled as he strode back to his seat with a slightly awkward look on his face. Prior to returning to his table, he took a deep breath, and then pinched his nose before also sitting back down. A slight wisp of the stinky tofu's aroma entered through his restricted nostrils, and his face immediately turned red. However, on this occasion, he didn't immediately rear back. Instead, he forced himself to remain in his seat and truly experience the aroma of the dish. After setting aside his preconceived notions of the dish and enduring the initial putrid odor, he also gradually pinpointed a unique fragrance, and the aroma suddenly wasn't all that unbearable anymore. Thus, he released his nose, and was suddenly struck by the feeling that this aroma was rather alluring. He turned to Yabimiya, and said, "I'll also get a stinky tofu." Everyone's stinky tofu dishes were quickly brought out, and Harrison picked up a piece with his chopsticks before placing it in his own mouth. The hot and spicy juices splattered all over his tongue as he bit down onto the piece of tofu, and his face immediately became flushed again as he opened his mouth and panted urgently. The flabby rolls all over his body were trembling, but he simply couldn't bear to spit out the delicious stinky tofu in his mouth, and tears were beginning to well up in his eyes. A delicious flavor spread through Harrison's entire mouth, but tears were streaming down his face as he murmured to himself, "You've ruined me, Boss Mag." Another burst of raucous laughter rang out in the entire restaurant. As for the other customers who'd ordered stinky tofu, they had mentally prepared themselves for what was to come, but when their dishes were first brought to them, they were still dealt heavy blows by its overwhelming distinctive aroma. Many of them even sprang out of their chairs in an instinctive reaction. However, after tasting the dishes for themselves, they were completely won over by its captivating flavor. Following the conclusion of the breakfast service, Mag went upstairs and changed out of his chef's suit, then turned to Yabimiya and the others, who were cleaning up the restaurant, and said, "I'm going out for a bit. The restaurant needs to expand, and I have to hire a new employee." After that, he pushed his bicycle out the door. 862 ER. I don't need one with a huge chest, I prefer flat-chested ones. System, you said that after reaching level 4, I can expand the restaurant for free. What does this expansion entail? Also, how much money is required for me to upgrade to level 4? After being upgraded to level 4, the system will help you expand the restaurant from an 18-table capacity to a 36-table capacity, which means you'll be able to serve a maximum of 144 customers at once. The area of the kitchen will also be expanded by twofold. Upgrading to level 4 only requires 50 million spending points. You currently have 5,521,250 spending points, so you're missing 44,478,750 spending points, the system replied with a smile in its voice. What kind of restaurant require 50 million to construct? Mag raised an eyebrow upon hearing this. Even though spending points weren't the same as real money, he was still quite displeased to hear this. Of course, his displeasure simply stemmed from his poverty. At present, the restaurant earned him around 1 million copper coins of pure profit per day. Even so, he'd still only been able to save up around 50 million, so the system was clearly planning to completely rob him clean in one go. Strength, how much does a strength point cost now? Mag asked. At present, one strength point costs 25 million, and the next one will cost 40 million copper coins, the system replied in an enthusiastic manner. Mag raised an eyebrow before demanding, "Sell me the 2 strength points for 50 million and waive the construction fee for the restaurant expansion as well. If you don't like that price, I'll just construct everything myself." Do you know how much effort and resources are expended to calculate the amount of energy and angle of each lightning strike? On top of that, each successive strength point requires several times the expenditure of the previous strength point. The price I'm offering you is already the cost price, yet you're still trying to barter with me. Do you not have conscience? The system wailed in an indignant manner. So you are selling or not? Mag rolled his eyes in a nonchalant manner. No way, the system replied in a firm voice. All right then, looks like I'll have to find a construction team first. It's going to be a little slow, but it shouldn't cost me all that much, Mag murmured to himself before suddenly noticing a carpenter's workshop nearby, so he began to ride his bicycle toward it. Don't do that. Everything is negotiable. If you look for someone else, they won't be able to do anywhere near as good a job as the system can, and they'll take far longer to do it as well. On top of that, their materials can't compare with the materials used by the system. Who else in Chaos City is going to get you wood from a 1,000-year-old tree in the wind forest? If there's a mismatch in the construction style, the restaurant will look hideous. The system hurriedly tried to dissuade Mag from hiring alternative labor. That's all right, I can just get rid of all of the existing tables and chairs, then make sure that the new batch is all completely uniform, Mag said as a hint of a smile appeared on his face. Can you add a bit more to the price? The system asked in a feeble voice. All right, considering it's indeed true that you do use good materials, I'll throw in an extra 100 copper coins, Mag said as he parked his bicycle in front of the carpenter's workshop, and then threatened, if you don't agree to that, I'm going in right away. Deal, the system spat through gritted teeth. Good. Mag's smile widened as he turned around and rode his bicycle onward. 50 million copper coins was quite a hefty amount for him, but if that could allow him to attain the body of a 6th-tier knight, then it was well worth the price. On top of that, it was also very important for him to upgrade the restaurant so he could earn money more quickly. Only through earning more money could he purchase more strength points. It would take a long time before he could begin to profit from the steam engine, and Gloria's clothing shop was only in its infancy. As such, the restaurant was currently his main source of income, and the ice cream shop was also an important addition to that. After parking his bicycle outside Find All job finding service, Mag slowly walked into the building. Kreese was just in the process of speaking to his employees when he suddenly looked up and caught sight of Mag. He murmured to himself, why is he here? However, he still sent his employees away, and then put on a warm smile as he greeted, welcome, Boss Mag, are you here to hire another server? Mag had visited him on 2 previous occasions, but stood him up and found waitresses elsewhere on both instances, thereby completely wasting his time. As such, he didn't really want to deal with Mag. That's right, Boss Kreese, I want to hire another waitress, one that's beautiful, quick on her feet, clever, and doesn't demand high wages. Do you have anyone like that? Mag asked with a smile. If I found someone like that, I'd keep them for myself. Kreese rolled his eyes in response. If it weren't for the fact Mamie restaurant was currently extremely popular in the Aiden Square, he would have definitely thought that Mag had come here to prank him. How could anyone possibly satisfy all of those criteria? Mag wasn't irked by his response, and he continued, I heard that many elves have come to Chaos City recently, the City Lord's castle will be helping them with employment options, right? Do you want to hire an elf, Boss Mag? Kreese asked with furrowed brows. Their job-finding service did indeed receive an invitation from the City Lord's castle recently. That's right. I can pay you twice the normal fee, but I have some requirements that must be satisfied, Mag replied as he nodded with a smile. Kreese's eyes immediately lit up upon hearing this, and he hurriedly prompted, go ahead and state your requirements, Boss Mag, I'll go to the City Lord's castle to source some candidates for you right away. Mag thought about it for a moment before replying, I want a waitress that's around 15 to 16 years old, and quite good looking. I don't need one with a huge chest, I prefer flat-chested ones. Aside from that, I want someone who's more docile and isn't too rowdy. That'll be all. As for wages, I can offer 1,500 copper coins per month, and aside from undertaking waitress duties, she also has to babysit for me from time to time. Haha, I get it. You want someone docile and obedient, eh? I didn't think you were grooming girls from a young age, Boss Mag, Kreese said with a knowing smile. I don't understand what you're saying, Boss Kreese, all I want is to hire a good server. Mag shrugged in a resigned manner. He was only doing his best to give a description of Thera's traits. Kreese pulled a contract out of a nearby drawer, and then scribbled something on it before handing it over to Mag. Please sign here, boss. Also, we recently introduced a new rule, which requires 10% of the fee to be issued in advance. If you're willing to pay double the normal fee, then 10% of that will be a deposit of 300 copper coins. We'll recommend candidates to you until you find one you're happy with. Alright, I hope to hear back from you as soon as possible, Boss Kreese. Mag quickly signed the contract before handing over the deposit. I'll go to the city lord's castle right away. I'll definitely find one that you'll like, and then take her to you in person for inspection. Kreese put away the contract and the deposit before accompanying Mag out the door with a wide smile on his face. After Mag's departure, Kreese immediately got onto a horse-drawn carriage with one of his employees, and the two of them headed straight to the city lord's castle. 863 What's the point of all this unnecessary rambling? On an empty plot of land in front of the city lord's castle, a series of tables had been arranged. Sitting behind these tables were people from employment centers as well as those who were looking to hire new employees. All of them were waiting for the arrival of the elves who were seeking employment. During this recent period, the elven population in Chaos City had been rapidly increasing, but a large proportion of them were children and elderly elves, while just a small proportion were in their prime. However, elves had extremely long lifespan, so given their polite mannerism and graceful demeanor, even elderly elves were quite popular with employers. Under normal circumstances, wages for elven employees were quite high, but due to the fact that these elves were trying to find employment as quickly as possible so they could settle permanently in Chaos City, the wages offered were going to be slightly lower than usual, and that was something that the city lord's castle had accepted to be inevitable. After all, these elves had only just arrived at Chaos City, and employers had to spend time and effort to train them before they could succeed in their roles. There were many elves going from table to table, trying to find a job that was suitable for themselves, and then conversing in greater depth with the employers and the personnel from employment centers. This employment convention was being held by the city lord's castle, so it was guaranteed that there were no traps waiting for these elves. After all, no matter how unscrupulous a business was, they wouldn't dare to risk offending the city lord's castle. Most of the elves wore wide smiles on their faces as they prepared to begin a brand new chapter of their lives in this city. To most of them, a job was something that was completely new and intriguing. In the past, they were one with nature, foraging for fruits and nuts as food while living inside trees. However, here in Chaos City, there were no fruits and nuts for them to pick, nor any tree hollows for them to live in. If they wanted to live here, they had to find jobs, and then exchange their labor for income so they could purchase necessities like clothes and food. This was a brand new way of life. At the very least, that was what Firis thought. She had lived her entire life in the Wind Forest, and as she cast her gaze over the employment information being displayed around her, she discovered that many of the jobs being offered were simply incomprehensible to her. These jobs included things like cleaning up storefronts, serving customers. All of them were completely alien, and she couldn't bring herself to be interested in them. Many of the employers had set their sights on Firis. A young and beautiful elf like her was very popular, and there weren't many of them present during this convention. She was a little thin and looked somewhat frail, but she would be perfect as a pretty face hired as a front desk attendant. Many of the employers were already racking their brains, trying to think of conditions that they could offer that would make them stand out among all of the other employers present. What kind of job will allow me to pass his test? Firis thought to herself with her brows furrowed. All she wanted to do was to pass Alex's test as quickly as possible, and then look after the young mistress to the best of her ability and await the day when she would be reunited with the princess. Kreese had been sitting around for 2 hours, and only signed up 2 elderly elves during this process. However, his eyes immediately lit up at the sight of Firis. She was around 15 to 16 years of age and quite beautiful in appearance. She seemed to be the quiet and docile type, and most importantly, her chest was flat. Perfect. She's perfect. She satisfies all of Mag's criteria. Kreese immediately rose to his feet before quickly making his way over to Firis, stopping her in her tracks with a smile on his face as he said, "Hello there, I am the owner of the Find All job finding service, and I have a job that's perfect for you, would you be interested?" Shameless. All of the employers who had set their sights on Ferris were rather annoyed to see this. Some of them were even making their way toward her, getting ready to pounce as soon as she turned down Kreese's offer. If they were to miss out on her, who knew when the next one would come along? A young and beautiful elf like her was perfect for countless workplaces. "A job that's perfect for me," Ferris repeated with a curious look on her face. She didn't even know what kind of job was suitable for herself, so how did this man know what type of job was perfect for her? Don't buy his nonsense. He doesn't know anything about, yet he's already making empty promises, he's clearly not trustworthy. "I have a job here that is truly perfect for you," a portly employer said in an urgent manner. Everyone else also tried to get a word in, and all of them began to bicker loudly around Ferris. "Don't be too quick to make your decision, listen to what the jobs they're offering entail, then make an informed decision. No one can force you to do anything against your will here," an employee from the city lord's castle who was supervising the convention reminded. Ferris hurriedly nodded in response. She had been given quite a fright by all of these employers flocking to her at once. She had been concerned that no one would want her, but it appeared that she was very much a hot commodity. After taking a deep breath to compose herself, she turned to Kreese, and said, "You still haven't told me what job you have that's perfect for me. You've heard of Mamie Restaurant, right? It's the most renowned restaurant in Chaos City. The owner of the restaurant has just returned from King Andre's royal birthday banquet, and received the Best Dish award there. He's by far the best chef in Chaos City, and not only does he possess superb cooking skills, he's also very young and handsome. Even the city lord himself has visited his restaurant on many occasions," and Kreese began to deliver a long-winded spiel about the glorious past of Mag and Mamie Restaurant. "How about you tell us what kind of job the owner of Mamie Restaurant is offering, and what's the monthly wage he's willing to pay?" "What's the point of all this unnecessary rambling?" another employer asked as he pursed his lips. Ahem, Kreese cleared his throat in a slightly awkward manner, he was feeling rather flustered at the sight of all of these competitors. If his conditions didn't prove to be alluring enough to Ferris, then these employers would immediately swoop in to take her from him. However, 1,500 copper coins was simply far too low of a monthly wage for him to be able to announce it with confidence. After taking a glance at the competing employers and the city lord's castle employee nearby, Kreese continued, "This exceptionally talented chef and restaurant owner is currently looking for a waitress to work at his restaurant, which is just as exceptional as he is. If you were to work there, you'd surely also become exceptional, and on top of that, you get 3 free staff meals per day cooked by Boss Mag. To be able to enjoy such delicious foods as a part of your job would be cut the chit-chat. Just tell us the monthly wage that he's offering," another employer urged in an impatient manner. Ferris was also looking at Kreese intently, awaiting a response to this question. She didn't have much a concept of money, but the employees of the Chaos City had given them a detailed introduction of what money was, as well as what it could be used for. It was next to impossible to live in Chaos City without money, so the more money one had, the better. Looking around at everyone's intense eyes, Kreese wanted to dig a hole and bury himself in there. As opposed to continuing with his pointless rambling, he mustered up his courage, and summarized, "You'll be getting 1,500 copper coins a month, and that includes food and accommodation. On top of that, you'll occasionally have to babysit for the owner, who has a half-elf daughter around 4 to 5 years old." 864 Boss Mag, I've got the one you re looking for, hat, 1,500 copper coins? Our shop is hiring a front desk attendant, and we're offering 5,000 copper coins a month. Workdays are from 9 to 5 with weekends off, and the work is very easy. All you have to do is sit behind the front desk, and food and accommodation are also included. Being a restaurant waitress is a super tiring job. Not only do you have to carry out food for customers, you have to wash dishes, wipe the floor, and clean up the restaurant. You'll be standing for the entire day, and you won't even get a chance to catch your breath. Why don't you come to our company as a spokesperson? All you have to do is help display our new products once a week, and you'll get 6,000 copper coins per month. You can do whatever you want with the rest of your time. Our boss needs a secretary, and he's offering 15,000 copper coins a month. You eat whatever he eats, and you live wherever he lives. This job is way better than anything else these people have to offer. Everyone began to bicker once again while throwing the occasional insult at Kreese. It was downright delusional to think that one could hire a young and beautiful elf for just 1,500 copper coins a month. Kreese heaved a faint internal sigh upon seeing this. The conditions being offered were quite alluring even to him, and in comparison, working for 1,500 copper coins per month was a completely unattractive option. Thankfully, he'd already taken that deposit of 300 copper coins from Mag, and he certainly wasn't going to return that. However, much to his surprise, Ferris ignored everyone else and stared directly at Kreese as she asked, "Did you just say that I'll have to look after the owner's 4-year-old half-elf daughter from time to time?" At this point, Kreese had already given up hope, but he immediately looked up as if he'd been thrown a lifeline upon hearing this. "Well, if you're really against babysitting, I can discuss this matter with Boss Mag. This restaurant owner is a tyrant. Not only is he offering such low wages, he's also going to force you to babysit for him in your spare time. You'll definitely regret working for someone like him," a fat employer urged in a heartfelt manner. Everyone else also chimed in agreement. With the conditions being offered, even a normal middle-aged woman would most likely turn down the job, let alone a young and beautiful elf. However, Ferris nodded in a determined manner, and said, "All right, I'll take this job." "Hey? What did you just say?" Kreese was struggling to believe his ears. Everyone else also immediately fell silent as they stared at Ferris with incredulity in their eyes. "I think you're right, this job is indeed perfect for me," Ferris said with a serious look on her face. "Do you want to reconsider?" Kreese almost blurted that out in a reflexive response. All of the other jobs being offered were far better than working as a restaurant waitress for 1,500 copper coins a month. However, as a seasoned businessman, Kreese was able to immediately cast aside that irrational train of thought as he opened up a path among the stunned employers, then pointed at a nearby stall, and said, "Right this way, please. We'll sign a contract, and I'll take you to the restaurant soon." "All right." Ferris nodded before following along behind Kreese obediently. Was she dropped on her head as a baby? She's giving up on 15,000 copper coins a month to become a restaurant server and a part-time babysitter. That job should be her last choice. Are these elves really just naive or plain stupid? All of the employers looked on with flabbergasted expressions as Ferris departed with Kreese. They suddenly felt as if they didn't understand this world anymore. However, the city lord's castle had stipulated that the elven job seekers were free to make their own decisions, and no one could force them into accepting jobs against their will, so they couldn't do anything. "You don't know anything. This is Mamie restaurant we're talking about here, and their servers get to have their fill of all types of delicious food every day. If we were to convert these free meals into money, she'd at least be getting 30,000 copper coins a month. In my opinion, she's far smarter than all of you," a young man said with pursed lips as he passed through the area. 30,000 copper coins worth of free meals a month. Everyone drew a sharp breath upon hearing this before falling completely silent. They all cast a final wistful glance at Ferris before returning to their tables, waiting for the next suitable candidate to turn up. After signing a contract with Ferris, Kreese was very afraid that she'd suddenly change her mind, or that other employers would swoop in to try and steal her away. As such, he immediately departed from the city lord's castle and headed toward Mamie restaurant with her. "Can I ask what the restaurant owner's daughter is like?" Ferris asked in a quiet voice after they got onto a horse-drawn carriage together. Kreese thought back to the little girl who had coined for him the nickname Mr. Nest, and his lips twitched in a rather awkward manner. However, he disguised this reaction with a smile as he replied, "She's a super adorable little girl." Ferris smiled and nodded upon hearing this. She didn't think that she'd be able to find a job where she could look after a half-elf little girl. The monthly wage seemed to be slightly low, but food and accommodation were included, so that wasn't overly important to her. The most important thing to her was whether this job would allow her to pass Alex's test. It should be fine, right? Ferris thought to herself with anticipation and uneasiness in her heart. She had never looked after a small child before, so she had no experience whatsoever. When Kreese arrived at Mamie restaurant with Ferris in accompaniment, Mag just so happened to also be walking out of the neighboring forge with a contract in his hands. He'd already rented all 3 of Mabai's vacant storefronts, and was charged only 3 million copper coins for 10 years, so he'd received a sizable friendship discount. "Boss Mag, I've got the one you're looking for!" Kreese immediately yelled as soon as he caught sight of Mag after disembarking from the horse-drawn carriage. "You're quite efficient this time, Boss Kreese." Mag glanced at Ferris, who had just emerged from the horse-drawn carriage as well, and a smile appeared on his face, but he quickly turned his attention back to Kreese. "Is he the restaurant owner? From what I heard earlier, he also seems to be a really good chef, but he looks so young, and those eyes. They seem familiar to me somehow." Ferris was carefully appraising Mag with a curious look in her eyes. A young and handsome man like him didn't seem to belong in a kitchen, and what especially drew her attention was his eyes. Those familiar eyes harbored within them a gentle light, but he was sure that this was the first time she'd ever met this man. "Of course. Your request is my top priority, Boss Mag. This is Miss Ferris, and she would like to apply for the role of waitress at your restaurant. Would you like to speak with her?" Kreese gave Mag a quick knowing wink as he spoke. "All right, please come in." Mag nodded with a smile before making his way over to the restaurant doors and pushing them open. "Come in, Miss Ferris," Kreese called out as he entered the restaurant behind Mag. "All right." Ferris nodded in response. The slab of floor-to-ceiling glass had her feeling slightly awestruck, and the crisp tinkling of a bell rang out as she opened the door. She was then greeted by the sight of a beautiful restaurant with refined decor and a soothing atmosphere. The wooden furniture was quite warm and welcoming, art pieces on the walls were spectacular to behold, and every single ornament matched the rest of the restaurant to perfection. "Please take a seat." Mag's voice cut short Ferris' slight stupor, and she turned around to look into Mag's eyes. He was holding 2 glasses of water, and those gentle eyes of his seemed to possess a unique allure that drew in the onlooker. 865 Congratulations, you've been hired. Ferris faltered momentarily before returning to her senses, and she immediately turned her gaze away as a faint blush appeared on her face before she sat down next to Kreese. Mag placed a glass of water down before both Kreese and Ferris, then sat down across from Ferris as he smiled, and asked, "Miss Ferris, is that correct?" "Yes," Ferris replied in a quiet voice as she stared into the glass of water before her, not daring to look into Mag's eyes. Mag was feeling rather amused as the current timid and nervous Ferris seemed to be a completely different person compared to the young woman who was threatening to jump down from his griffin the day before. With that in mind, he smiled, and said, "I am the owner of Mamie Restaurant, Mag. Seeing as Boss Kreese brought you over to see me, I'm sure you've already developed a certain level of understanding in regards to our restaurant. However, what I want to do now is to test your abilities." "All right." Ferris nodded as she wrung her hands together in a reflexive manner. She had thought that she'd be able to get to work right away, but who would have thought that the owner was going to test her? If she were to fail the test, then she wouldn't be able to get this job. Kreese became a little flustered upon hearing this. He felt as if he'd virtually swindled Ferris into coming with him, yet Mag was going to test her rather than hire her right away? That was ridiculous. As such, he hurriedly said, Boss Mag, Miss Ferris is an extremely smart and clever girl, and you're only offering 1,500 copper coins as a monthly wage, so we can just skip the test, can't we? This a rule of the restaurant, and it's something I refuse to compromise on. My restaurant doesn't need a pretty face, I need a waitress who can truly offer a useful skill set, Mag replied with a serious look on his face. Kreese's eyes widened upon hearing this. Was this the same man who had come to him this morning and asked him to find a timid flat-chested girl whom he could groom from a young age? In contrast, Ferris' eyes lit up upon hearing this. She didn't want to just be a pretty face, and she was even more averse to earning unscrupulous income by selling her appearance and body. As such, Mag's words were interpreted by her as a gesture of respect. Even though the monthly wage being offered was only 1,500 copper coins, this was still not a job that was open to anyone. As such, she looked up at Mag with a serious expression, and said, "Please begin your test. What do you think you'll be responsible for in this restaurant, and what skills do you have that will allow you to succeed in this role?" Mag asked in a serious manner. Hiring Ferris was Mag's way of fulfilling the promise of looking after Ferris that he had made to Irina, but he didn't want to hire a useless pretty face for the restaurant. After all, if all he wanted were pretty faces, Sally and Mia were already exceptional at that role. He wanted to give her an opportunity, not a free job. As for why he decided to use Kreese as a middleman, that was because he didn't want Ferris to know that he was Alex. A secret could only be well kept if the least number of people possible knew about it. The more people were aware of a secret, the higher the likelihood that it would spread, and in that case, the secret would cease to be a secret. What are my responsibilities? A contemplative look appeared on Ferris' face. She looked around at the entire restaurant to find that it was spotlessly clean, even in the most hard-to-reach areas, so they clearly weren't lacking a cleaner. As for serving customers, she didn't think that she'd have the courage nor the ability to do so. After all, she found it difficult to even utter coherent sentences when meeting strangers for the first time. In the end, she cast her gaze toward the kitchen, and her eyes lit up with confidence. She turned back to Mag, and said, "I can help out in the kitchen, I'm one of the top 5 best chefs in the Wind Forest." Top 5? A hint of surprise appeared on Mag's face. Top 5? Kreese also exclaimed as he stared at Ferris as if she were some kind of prized treasure. A thought suddenly occurred to him as he smiled, and said, "Boss Mag, if you don't think she's suitable for this job, then I can leave with Miss Ferris right now. I'll be sure to find another suitable candidate for you. If you want, I can even return the 300 copper coins that you issued to me as a deposit." One of the top 5 chefs of the Wind Forest could easily become the head chef of any restaurant in Chaos City. In particular, if he could introduce such an exceptional elf to a restaurant that served elven cuisine, he'd be able to at least receive 10,000 copper coins for his efforts. He was already beginning to regret not learning about this from Ferris on the way here. "Don't be in such a hurry, Boss Kreese. I'll only be able to determine whether she's suitable or not after the test. My restaurant just so happens to be missing an assistant chef, so if Miss Ferris really is an exceptional chef, she'd be perfect for my restaurant," Mag said with a smile. He could naturally see exactly what Kreese was thinking. Thus, he rose to his feet and made his way over to the kitchen as he said, "Please show me what you can do, Miss Ferris." Ferris also stood up before walking over to the entrance of the kitchen behind Mag. There, she was greeted by the sight of a bright and clean kitchen with cooking utensils of all different shapes and sizes. In particular, there was a thick and sturdy rectangular chef's knife that was extremely eye-catching, and she couldn't help but gawk in amazement. A chef paid a lot of attention to their kitchen, and she was very pleased with her own kitchen as it contained the most complete set of kitchenware out of any kitchen in the entire Wind Forest. However, compared to Mag's kitchen, her kitchen was nothing. She couldn't even decipher the function of most of the knives hanging from the walls. Mag pulled a potato out of the fridge before placing it onto a nearby chopping board, then turned to Ferris, and said, "Choose a knife for yourself, then chop this potato into rice-sized cubes. The more uniform the shapes and sizes of the pieces, the better. Rice-sized pieces. Firis looked at the potato with a confident expression on her face. She slowly made her way over to Mag's large collection of knives and hesitated for a long while before choosing that thick and maladroit chef's knife that had caught her eye earlier. Quite frankly, this knife looked a little ugly and archaic, but it seemed to possess some kind of magical power that made it impossible for her to ignore it. Even though there were prettier and lighter knives all around it, she was still drawn to that one knife in the end. The knife was slightly cool to the touch, and it was around twice as heavy as a normal chef's knife. However, it was also very balanced, so she didn't feel like its extra weight was a burden. She's got a good eye. Mag was rather surprised that Firis had chosen the Chinese chef's knife. After that, Firis made her way over to the chopping board and gently raised a hand. The potato on the chopping board flew into the air, and Firis slashed the knife in her hand over it in a series of rapid strokes, peeling off strips of skin that were carrying virtually no trace of potato at all. That's amazing! Kreese was absolutely flabbergasted upon seeing this. The potato, which was peeled in the blink of an eye, fell back onto the chopping board. Firis raised the knife before bringing it down again, and the knife transformed into a blur, thudding onto the chopping board in a rapid yet consistent rhythm that was very pleasing to the ears. The pleasant rhythmic thudding then suddenly ceased, and Firis put down the knife before taking 2 steps backward, leaving a pile of potato cubes on the chopping board. The pieces of potato were all of the bright golden color and virtually completely identical in shape and size. "Congratulations, you've been hired," Mag said with a completely genuine smile. He'd found himself a treasure. 866 I heard you're a very famous chef, really. Firis stared at Mag with a hint of shock and elation on her face. She had thought that she'd have to undergo many tests, but who would have thought that Mag would make such an announcement after only asking her to chop up a potato? This surprise came far too abruptly to her, and she was struggling to come to terms with it. "That's right. You can start working tomorrow. If you'd like, you can stay at the restaurant during the lunch service and familiarize yourself with the environment here. I'll write up a contract for you, and you'll be undertaking a 3-month probation period, following which you'll become an official employee and enjoy all of the benefits available to the other official employees," Mag said with a smile and a nod. Not taking into account anything else, just Firis' cutting skills alone made it a no-brainer for him to hire her. Kreese was appraising Firis with a complex expression. He felt as if he'd picked up a gold nugget, and then sold it for a cabbage. This young woman was way too stupid. She was selling herself for 1,500 copper coins per month, and she looked so happy during the process. This was downright incredible to him. However, seeing as the two of them had already arrived at an agreement and Mag had issued the deposit, Kreese certainly wasn't going to do something out of line just to try and maximize his profits. As such, he rose to his feet, and said, "Looks like you're very pleased with Miss Firis, Mr. Mag. In that case, I wish you good luck in all your future endeavors. I'll be going back now." "Thank you, Boss Kreese, you've found the perfect new employee for me. Please wait for a moment, I'll issue the rest of the fee right away." Mag made his way over to the counter before quickly returning with a small bag of coins. Kreese counted the coins to verify that there were 2,700 in the bag, and his smile also became a lot more genuine. He had earned 3,000 copper coins in less than half a day, and even though it certainly wasn't a big deal, he did enjoy jobs with such quick turnover. As such, he put away the bag, and nodded at Mag as he said, "Thank you for your prompt payment, Boss Mag. I look forward to working with you again next time. If I ever need to hire new employees in the future, I'll be sure to come and find you," Mag replied with a nod and a smile. 3,000 copper coins was a rather hefty amount to hire a middleman, especially when Mag had basically done everything aside from blatantly telling Kreese who was the person that he wanted. However, everything turned out to be worth it in the end, and Firis turned out to be a surprise package that was well worth the investment. Of course, the benefit of using Kreese as a middleman was that it saved him a lot of trouble. At the very least, it wasn't that easy for others to become suspicious of him now. After seeing off Kreese, Mag returned to the restaurant and began to carefully appraise Firis. She appeared to still be only around 14 to 15 years old, and she had a pair of beautiful eyes set on a slightly round face. Her hair had been organized into a little bun on the top of her head, giving her a pure and cute appearance. She was currently sitting behind the table, holding her glass of water with both hands with her back ramrod straight, appearing as if she were very nervous and uneasy. In reality, she was indeed feeling quite anxious. Ever since she'd been born, she'd never been alone with an unfamiliar man in an enclosed space. Irina's wise words were constantly echoing through her mind, telling her that no matter what excuse a man used to try and get her alone with him, she had to refuse. If that didn't work, she would have to resort to kicking him between the legs, and then quickly running away. This was because most men had impure intentions when approaching women. Firis could refuse to believe anyone else, but she trusted Irina unconditionally with all her heart. With that in mind, Firis was becoming even more nervous. She could sense that Mag was carefully appraising her, and through the distorted image that she could see in her glass of water, it appeared that he wasn't standing very far away from her. Could it be that following Kreese's departure, Mag was going to cast aside all pretenses and show her his true colors? Even though she wasn't a powerful magic caster and most of the spells she knew were more geared toward assisting others, she was still a 5th-tier magic caster, so she'd be able to take care of a normal human with no issues whatsoever. After taking a quick glance at the wand hanging from her waist, Firis was feeling slightly less anxious. Just as these thoughts were racing through Firis' mind, Mag suddenly said, "You can feel free to have a look around the restaurant, there's no need to be so tense. If you find this place boring, you can also go back after you sign the contract, and then just come back tomorrow morning before 7:30 am." Firis' train of thought was immediately cut off by Mag's words, and she looked up to find Mag appraising her with a pair of bright and gentle eyes. The princess had told her no one could lie with their eyes, so perhaps he wasn't a bad person, after all. Mag was rather amused by Firis' timid display. In essence, she was a sheltered young woman who had only interacted with a very select group of people in her life, so there were many things that she had to learn. As such, Mag smiled, and continued, "I may be the owner of the restaurant, but I hope you can treat me as a friend. That way, we'll both be more comfortable. There are also 3 other waitresses that work here, and I hope you can get along with them as well." Firis stared into Mag's eyes for a while, and for some reason, her cheeks were beginning to feel a little hot again, so she quickly nodded in response before averting her gaze. However, as Mag turned toward the counter, Firis was struck by a sense of familiarity again as she caught sight of his profile from behind. From this angle, he looked so much like the man sitting on the griffin a few days ago. No, there's no way that he'd become a chef, so they can't be the same person. Firis quickly shook her head to rid herself of that ridiculous thought. Mag pulled out a pen as well as a contract that he'd already prepared earlier, and he placed both of them before Firis as he said, "This is the contract, you can read over it to see if there are any concerns you want to raise." Firis picked up the contract before looking at it carefully. She was quite sheltered and timid, but she certainly wasn't stupid. Food and accommodation were included, but she had to do her job diligently every day. As for the monthly wage, a hint of surprise suddenly appeared on Firis' face upon reading this section of the contract, and she looked up at Mag as she asked, "Did you put the wrong number here? 3,500 copper coins is your probationary monthly wage, and after you pass your 3-month probation period, there's a chance that you could receive a further pay rise. I've decided on this monthly wage based on your level of ability," Mag explained with a smile. Setting aside everything else, his conscience simply wouldn't allow him to offer a measly 1,500 copper coins a month to an employee with such exceptional cutting skills. "Thank you," Firis said in a grateful manner, and she was truly beginning to look forward to starting her job. After carefully reading through the contract, she signed it to seal the deal. I welcome you as the newest staff member of Mamie Restaurant. I'm going to prepare the ingredients that we'll be requiring for the lunch service now. You can do as you please in the meantime, Mag said as he picked up the contract. Ferris mustered up her courage before looking up at Mag as she said, "Can I watch you cook? I heard you're a very famous chef." "Of course." Mag nodded in response. He had been truly stunned after seeing Ferris' talent. She was the first person he'd seen with cutting skills that weren't inferior to his, and the fact was that she'd honed these skills without a test field for the god of cookery like he had, so she was a far more talented chef than he was. After all, even with the experience the system had passed on to him, it had still taken him many dozens of days of wholehearted practice in the test field for the god of cookery to attain these cutting skills. Of course, Mag was more curious about Ferris' cooking skills. She had said that she was one of the 5 best chefs of the Wind Forests, but did elves even cook? Didn't their diet consist entirely of fruits and nuts? In any case, Mag was feeling slightly skeptical. Now that more and more customers were coming to the restaurant, and expansion was imminent, Mag would most likely struggle to keep up on his own. If he could have an assistant chef that could share some of the burden, even if it were just to prepare the ingredients, he'd most definitely be able to work a lot more efficiently. Anna possessed decent aptitude, and she could be a great helper in the future, but she was only a small child at the moment, so Mag certainly wasn't going to ask her to help him in the kitchen during the services. After going out this morning, Mag was already on a slightly tight schedule, so he paid no further heed to Ferris, throwing on an apron before pulling out ingredients from the fridge to prepare for the lunch service. Ferris stood at the entrance of the kitchen, watching as Mag used the rather strange-looking chef's knife in an expert manner. A rhythmic tapping soon rang out from the chopping board, and all of the ingredients were cut into extremely uniform shapes and sizes, just as if Mag were a machine rather than a human. That's amazing. He's not using any magic at all, yet even though he's a little slower than me, all of his cuts are so incredibly accurate. It's almost impossible to believe someone could be capable of such incredible precision. Ferris' mouth gradually grew open. She had always been extremely confident in her own painstakingly honed cooking skills, but she was still very amazed by Mag's exemplary cutting skills. Time flew by quickly, and Ferris looked on in a completely entranced manner, not just because of Mag's cutting skills, but also the innovative ways in which he cut his ingredients. Many of the ingredients were cut into shapes and sizes that others would never even consider. For example, why was he cutting potatoes into rice grain-sized pieces? Ferris was quite curious and intrigued. After placing the final portion of diced potatoes on a plate off to the side, he set his chef's knife aside and flexed his slightly sore wrist. Even though he was doing this every day, it still wasn't an easy task. Right at this moment, Amy's mellow voice suddenly sounded outside. "Father, I'm back." This was followed by a burst of knocking on the door. "Coming." A smile appeared on Mag's face as he wiped his hands clean before quickly making his way over to the door. Ugly Duckling was sleeping on the counter, and it also suddenly opened its eyes before slowly sliding down onto the ground along the side of the counter, and then rushing over to the door behind Mag. "Is that his daughter, the little half-elf girl?" Ferris also cast her gaze toward the door with a nervous look on her face. She had never interacted with a small child before, but she had to grow accustomed to and become good at it. Only then could she have the courage and confidence to stand before Alex and request to look after the young mistress again. According to Kreese, the restaurant owner's daughter was around 4 to 5 years old, so she was similar in age to the young mistress. If she could look after the owner's daughter well, then she'd also be able to succeed in looking after the young mistress. With that in mind, Ferris forced a smile onto her face to try and make herself appear more benevolent and approachable. As soon as the door was opened, a little girl immediately rushed in. She wore a little purple dress and had delicate porcelain-like skin. Her pointy little ears were almost completely transparent, and her large blue eyes were like vast ocean. Her silver hair had been arranged into a pair of pretty little braids, and she wore a wide smile on her face as she dove into Mag's arms. Blue eyes, silver hair, and she looks so much like the princess, even the way that she smiles looks so much like the princess. How? How is this possible? Ferris looked on at Amy with incredulity in her eyes as the latter was scooped up into Mag's arms. Hey! Amy also caught sight of Ferris at this moment, and a curious look appeared on her face as she asked, "Father, who's this big sister?" "This is big sister Ferris. From today onward, she's also going to be working at our restaurant," Mag explained with a smile. "Hello, big sister Ferris, I'm Amy," Amy said with a vibrant smile on her face. Hello, Amy." Ferris was suddenly afflicted by a slightly dry throat. She was telling herself over and over again that there was no way Amy could be the young mistress, but still couldn't help but draw comparisons between her and the princess. If there were one person who knew Irina best, then it was her, not Alex. She had envisioned what the young mistress would look like many times in her heart based on Irina's appearance, and Amy was almost a perfect match for her mental image. It was just that, there was no way Alex could be the owner of this restaurant. Mag's cutting skills had already displayed to her that he was an extremely seasoned chef, as there was no way those cutting skills could be developed without many years of practice. Furthermore, the princess had told her in the past that Alex was completely useless when it came to cooking, so she had to cook for them all the time, and Alex was apparently a big fan of her food. Thinking back to the princess's cooking skills, Ferris could roughly imagine just how horrendous Alex's cooking skills had to be. "Big sister Ferris is so beautiful," Amy exclaimed before shifting her gaze downward, upon which she shook her head, and sighed. "But her chest is so small, it looks about the same as mine." After receiving this figurative stab to the heart, Ferris's conflicted emotions were suddenly cleared away. A hint of indignation and resignation appeared in her eyes as she suddenly noticed that Amy spoke in an extremely similar manner to the princess as well. However, she simply couldn't bring herself to be angry at the sight of Amy's adorable little face. "It's all right," Amy consoled. "Even though you won't be growing anymore, big sister Mia says I can still grow bigger." Ferris felt as if she were choking on a mouthful of her own blood. Even though she was used to receiving such verbal abuse from Princess Irina, the fact that these words were being spoken by such an adorable little girl somehow made them hurt even more. "It's all right. Big sister Babla says that women have to live for themselves and not care about what other people think," Amy consoled before murmuring in a low voice, "but then again, she's also very small as well. What is this familiar throbbing pain in my heart?" Ferris sniffled as she thought to herself. It had been a rather disconcerting experience not to hear the princess scathing criticism over the past few days, but who would have thought that she'd encounter a little girl who could fill in that role instead. Even as she was saying such hurtful things, her bright blue eyes were completely clear and innocent, so Ferris simply couldn't bring herself to resent this little girl. It was just like when she was with the princess, she was simply far too beautiful for anyone to stay mad at her for long. On top of that, they both spoke in such a matter-of-fact manner as if they were merely stating facts rather than delivering malicious insults, and that only made it more difficult for Ferris to be mad at them. She resembles the princess so strongly, even their mannerisms and the way they talk are the same. I'm sure the princess was just like her as a child. Ferris thought to herself, and the more she looked into Amy's eyes, the fonder she grew of her. She was suddenly beginning to really look forward to this job. Being able to interact with such an adorable little half-elf would surely make this job a lot more fun. At this moment, Yabimiya and Sally also arrived, and the former strode into the restaurant first with a curious look in her eyes. "Do we have a new colleague?" A wide smile then appeared on her face as she continued, "What a beautiful elf! I'm Mia, welcome to our restaurant." "I'm Babla. Welcome." Babla was also appraising Ferris with a curious look in her eyes, and there was an immediate connection between the two as they appeared to be around the same age. Ferris immediately became rather nervous at the sight of her new colleagues, but she then relaxed a little upon seeing Mia's friendly smile, and she hurriedly replied, I'm Firis, thank you for the warm welcome. Firis. Sally's footsteps faltered as she stared at Firis with a hint of bewilderment in her eyes. Why was Irina's personal maid here? Firis had also noticed Sally at this point, and she reflexively took a couple of steps backward. I'm Aisha. I'm responsible for clearing the tables and cleaning the restaurant. Welcome. After walking in through the door, Sally had already recomposed herself, and she appraised Firis in a calm manner as if she had no idea who Firis was. Thank you. Firis cast her eyes downward slightly. She didn't know if Sally had actually failed to recognize her or was simply putting on an act, but she didn't expose her for using a fake name. A while back, High Priestess Helena had suggested a few candidates to take over the position of princess, and among those candidates, Sally was the most powerful as well as the one who everyone thought had the greatest chance of replacing Irina. Now that Irina had been deposed as princess, the position was vacant, and barring any mishaps, there was a very good chance that Sally could become the new elven princess. However, she was rumored to be cultivating in seclusion in the territory of the Brewster family. What was she doing in Chaos City? And why had she become a restaurant waitress? This was simply incredible. Mag cast a quick glance at Sally and Firis, and he could tell that these two had clearly recognized each other. However, he wasn't overly concerned. By saving the elven captives from the Wind Forest, Sally was now in the same boat as Irina, so he didn't have to worry about her plotting against Firis. During this period of time in which he'd known Sally, she wasn't very talkative, but she always charged to the forefront whenever any danger arose, so she was most definitely a trustworthy friend. Furthermore, after running away from home and coming to Chaos City, Sally had distanced herself from the Wind Forest, and she might still be unaware of the drastic changes that had just taken place there. Mag had bought some information prior to this, thereby learning that the elven race was already preparing to select a new princess directly after the incident in the Wind Forest a few days ago. The elven queen was in seclusion, and Irina had been deposed, so it could be said that the elven race was now in its most vulnerable state in the past century. As such, they had to select a new princess for everyone to pin their hopes on, and Sally was naturally the most popular candidate. You can all chat and get to know one another, I'll go cook up some lunch. Mag placed Amy down onto the ground before making his way toward the kitchen. Big Sister Firis, you're an elf, Big Sister Sally, you're also an elf. Do you know each other? Amy asked in a curious manner. No, Sally replied with a shake of her head. Firis glanced at Sally before also shaking her head as she said, no. Amy was slightly disappointed to hear this, but a smile quickly reappeared as she said, that's all right, you two can get to know each other now. Boss is super strict with the staff that he hires, so you must possess some kind of super awesome skill, right, Firis? Yabimiya asked with a curious look in her eyes. Everyone also turned to her with intrigued expressions upon hearing this. Everyone had their own unique skill set that allowed them to excel in different duties in the restaurant, and that was a perfect indication that Mag chose his staff based on their abilities rather than their looks. I only know how to cook a little, Firis replied in a modest manner. The three waitresses were all extremely beautiful and made others comfortable in their presence. That was a truly exceptional skill in her eyes. Wow, you can cook? That's so awesome. We can't help out Boss Mag at all, so he's always having to do so many things by himself. If you can give him a hand, then that would be great. Mia exclaimed in an excited voice. Inside the kitchen, a smile appeared on Mag's face as he listened to the conversation between the women. He really enjoyed this comfortable work atmosphere. Mia's warm and bubbly demeanor gradually made Firis feel a lot more relaxed, and she slowly became more talkative as they began to discuss a variety of topics. Lunch was soon ready, and Mag carried everyone's dishes onto the table. He had prepared a young Joe fried rice for Firis as he was sure that she would enjoy the flavor of the spring of life. Thus, all six of them sat down around the table, and Firis stared at the alluring dishes before her with an awestruck expression on her face. At the center of the table was a fish that had been placed in a long platter. It was virtually buried under sliced chili peppers, but its aroma wasn't unbearably spicy as one would expect. Instead, it gave off a very captivating smell that made one salivate uncontrollably. The aroma of the chicken soup was also extremely enchanting to her, and she could detect a special fragrance from the dish. This wasn't an unfamiliar fragrance, as it belonged to a type of mushroom that could occasionally be found in the wind forest. After being dried under the sun, these mushrooms would emit an alluring aroma that made them similar to a condiment. She had once used this dried mushroom to cook a soup, which she found to be very appetizing. She didn't think that she'd be able to taste it here in conjunction with the chicken soup that Mag had made. However, what attracted her attention the most was the portion of beautiful fried rice that had been placed before her. The grains of rice were covered in golden egg, and ingredients of all different colors were combined into one dish, yet all of them had been diced into rice-sized pieces. She had been wondering why Mag insisted on chopping up some of the ingredients into such fine pieces, but her question had naturally been answered by this dish. Everyone else had already dug into their meals. Firis hesitated momentarily before also scooping a spoonful of fried rice into her mouth. "Oh! This is amazing!" Firis' eyes immediately lit up. The egg around the rice melted almost as soon as it entered her mouth, while the rice-sized pieces of winter bamboo shoot and peas were crunchy and refreshing. The grains of rice were also sweet and fragrant, forming a perfect combination with the soft ham, and she seemed to have also tasted a hint of shrimp in the dish. After swallowing her first mouthful of fried rice, a warm sensation spread through her entire body, and a delicious flavor lingered within her mouth. Of course, the most important element of the dish was the faint fragrance lurking within the rice. She was 100% sure that this was the fragrance of the spring of life, as she also cooked her rice using the spring of life. The flavor of the spring of life in this dish was a lot less pronounced than what she was used to, but she could definitely still detect traces of it. The spring of life was the holy spring of the elven race, and it was prohibited from being transported out of the wind forest, so how had Mag gotten his hands on it? Firis was rather confused by this issue, but her attention was then quickly drawn to the delectable flavors flourishing in her mouth. She had once thought that nothing was more delicious than the dew-covered fresh spirit fruits that were plucked down from the trees of the wind forest. Those were nature's creations, and eating them was like tasting a piece of nature. However, this young Joe fried rice dish completely changed her mind. The flavor of the spring of life was very faint in this dish, so it really didn't play a significant role here. What was truly delicious were the seemingly ordinary ingredients that were melting in her mouth. She was quite a confident chef, and she'd always tried to cook the most delicious food possible for the princess, but in that instant, she began to doubt her own cooking skills. Fruit was naturally the main source of food for the elven race, but there were also exceptional elven chefs who could embellish a dish without drowning out its original flavor, thereby making certain foods easier to consume and more alluring to the consumer, but the one constant was that maintaining the flavor and texture of the ingredients was a top priority. However, this young Joe fried rice completely bucked that trend. After slicing ingredients into such tiny pieces, their texture had obviously completely changed, but that only made them more harmonious and delicious. It was as if there were some kind of magical power between all of the ingredients that transformed them into something more delicious despite the fact that they had been altered and become drastically different from what they initially were. This directly contradicted the cooking philosophy that she had always firmly stood by, but she was awestruck by just how amazing the product of this cooking method was. So ingredients can be cooked like this? A thoughtful expression appeared on Firis' face, and a hint of admiration crept into her eyes as she cast her gaze toward Mag. For him to be able to combine so many ingredients in such perfect harmony made him a very admirable chef in her eyes. But where did he get the spring of life from? Could it be there are people in the wind forest who are smuggling the spring of life into the outside world? Firis was still feeling rather concerned about the presence of the spring of life in this dish. Even though she no longer belonged to the wind forest, her identity was rather special. If Mag really were somehow related to Spring of Life smugglers in the Wind Forest, she wouldn't be able to bring herself to place her full trust in him. The Yangzhou fried rice was irresistibly delicious, and she quickly finished it with relish. She then cast her gaze toward the spicy grilled fish at the center of the table. Just the sight of the red chili peppers covering the fish was making her sweat, and even though the aroma emanating from the dish wasn't all that sharp, it was still undeniably spicy. After a brief hesitation, Firas picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks before placing it into her mouth. A dish with such a strong spicy flavor was something that she would have never considered in the past. However, as she took her first bite, she discovered that the crispy fish skin and smooth meat created a perfect contrasting set of textures, while the juices that they'd been dipped in created an explosion of heat and spiciness in her mouth that made her want to yell out. Her tongue was slightly numb from her first mouthful of fish, but she simply couldn't stop eating it. The crispy and fragrant skin, and soft and smooth meat, the spicy yet delicious juices. All of them combined to open up a whole new world to her. So food can be cooked like this. Firas' eyes lit up further and further as she ate. This was her first time sharing a meal with these people, so she should have been more reserved and polite, but she simply couldn't control her chopsticks as they carried one piece of fish after another into her mouth. It was almost as if stopping for even a single instant would be sacrilegious to such a delicious dish. Everyone at the table simply looked on with amusement in their eyes, and they weren't irked in the slightest by her sloppy table manners. They had the pleasure of enjoying these delicious dishes every single day, yet even they struggled to maintain a semblance of good table manners, let alone someone who was tasting these dishes for the first time. Phew, after devouring the fish until there was only an empty skeleton left, Firas finally heaved a long sigh. A blush then appeared on her face as she came to realize that she'd eaten almost the entire fish by herself, and she hung her head in a guilty manner as she said, "I'm sorry. It was too delicious, so I couldn't help myself." "That's all right, we're glad you enjoyed it, big sister Firas. Also, you'll grow if you eat more," Amy said with a smile as she glanced at Firas' chest. Everyone also turned to appraise Firas' chest with contemplative expressions on their faces. Firas was at a loss for how to respond. Amy was clearly trying to console her, but why did it feel like an insult? Mag smiled as he said, "You have to make sure to eat until you're full. I'll normally try to cook according to how much everyone eats, but if there's not enough of a dish, I can just cook more, so you don't have to worry about everyone else missing out on the fish." "That's right. You look really adorable when you're eating, Firas," Mia also said with a warm smile on her face. "I'm full." Babla placed her spoon down with a nod. "Can I begin cleaning up now?" Sally had also put down her chopsticks, and was appraising Firas with a gentle smile on her face. A surge of warmth suddenly flowed through Firas' heart at the sight of everyone's benevolent expressions. She had been an orphan for as long as she could remember, and the only people who had ever been good to her were the princess and Snare, that latter of which she only met once in a while. Aside from that, she had rarely ever experienced kindness from others. However, here in this restaurant, she felt loved by everyone, and it was an extremely pleasant and warm feeling. She was like a little bird who had lost her way after coming to Chaos City, but she suddenly felt a sense of belonging here. "Thank you, everyone." Firas stood up and extended a deep bow to everyone, then turned to Mag, and said, "I'll definitely work hard. If possible, I'd like to start today." "Today?" Mag looked into Firas' determined eyes and hesitated momentarily before nodding as he said, "You can watch me cook during the lunch service, and I'll get you to prepare some of the ingredients required for the dinner service. As for whether you'll be able to cook the dishes on your own in the future, that will be down to your ability and the amount of effort you put in. I'll be sure to work hard." An elated smile appeared on Firas' face before she nodded in a solemn manner. After tasting Mag's incredible cooking, she'd already completely cast aside her pride as one of the best elven chefs of the Wind Forest, and she was determined to learn how to cook truly delicious food from Mag. After honing her cooking skills here, she could cook for the princess and the young mistress as well, and they would surely also enjoy this cooking. Hold on, I'll grab a work uniform for you. Mag rose to his feet, then turned to Sally and the others, and said, you can all begin preparing for the lunch service now. 870 Go on, I really want to hear you must be a really good chef, Firas. This is the first time boss has ever agreed to let anyone participate in cooking with him, Mia said as she looked at Firas in an awestruck manner. She had worked in kitchens for many years, but ever since coming to Mamie restaurant, she had never been asked to help with cooking, not even in ingredient preparation. Firas was also quite pleased to hear this, and she smiled at Mia in response. All good chefs had a certain level of pride, and they wouldn't allow just anyone to enter their kitchens. Big sister Irina asked me to keep an eye on the big sisters who try to get close to father. Amy thought to herself in a rather conflicted manner as she appraised Firas while holding Ugly Duckling in her arms. However, her expression immediately eased as her gaze crept down to Firas' chest. I'm sure it'll be fine if it's big sister Firas. Not long after that, Mag came downstairs again, and then handed a black and white chef's suit to Firas as he said, here's your work uniform, you can only come into the kitchen after putting it on. The bathroom is on the left-hand side on the second floor, and you can get changed in there. All right. Firas accepted the chef's suit, and a blush immediately appeared on her face. She quickly made her way upstairs, holding the chef's suit in her hands as if it were a hot potato. Are these his clothes? What do I do? Am I actually going to have to wear this? If I don't wear this, I won't be allowed into the kitchen, but if I do. These are clothes that have been worn by a man. Firas rushed into the bathroom before closing the door and fanning her flushed cheeks with her hands. A warm light illuminated the bathroom, and the clean mirror reflected her red cheeks. The smooth marble floor was very comfortable to look at, and there was a very large white bathtub separated from the rest of the bathroom by a semi-transparent glass panel. After taking a few deep breaths, Firas placed the chef's suit onto a rack beside her, and then began to strip off her own clothes. Are they really that small? After taking off her clothes, she couldn't help but appraise her diminutive chest in the mirror, upon which a resigned and dejected look immediately appeared on her face. It fits perfectly. After changing into the chef's suit, Firas was stunned to find that it was exactly the right size, just as if it had been custom-made for her. Even the shoes fit extremely snugly on her feet. Furthermore, the style of this chef's suit was also slightly different from the one that Mag was wearing. The waist was clearly more tapered, and the buttons ran diagonally down the front of her top, thereby giving the entire suit a softer and more feminine appearance. The white hat was also slightly shorter than the one Mag wore, while beneath the suit was a black apron, a pair of casual black pants, as well as a pair of flat black leather shoes. The style is quite unique, but I really do get a good feeling when I put on this uniform. Firas inspected her reflection in the mirror, and discovered that she seemed to have truly become a chef after putting on the chef's suit, which instilled within her a sense of purpose and direction. So these are new clothes. Firas stroked her chef's suit with a smile on her face, but for some reason, there was also the tiniest hint of dejection in her heart. After the table had been cleared, Firas had also finished getting changed, and she emerged from the bathroom before making her way downstairs. Amy looked up at her with surprise and elation in her eyes as she said, "Wow, you're wearing the same clothes as father. Are you going to become the second chef, big sister Firas?" Firas must be an exceptional chef to have been chosen by boss, Mia praised with a hint of admiration and envy in her eyes. Firas was rather embarrassed to have so many people staring at her, and she hung her head to look down at her shoes. She would blush whenever she spoke to anyone aside from Irina, so this was way too much attention compared to what she was normally used to. Mag nodded with a pleased smile as he inspected Firas in her chef's suit. She was someone who could truly help him in the kitchen, so he had chosen a chef's suit for her rather than a dress. He could sense that she was rather embarrassed, so he said, "You don't have to serve any customers, as you'll be working with me in the kitchen." All you have to do is stand beside me and watch during today's lunch service. All right. Ferris nodded in response. She glanced at the long line that had already gathered outside the restaurant before hurriedly making her way into the kitchen while heaving an internal sigh of relief. There was no way she could serve so many customers with how shy and awkward she was. Then let's begin the lunch service. The clock on the wall had just struck 11:30, and Mag made his way over to the restaurant's entrance before opening the door. Boss Mag! I've finally found you! Before Mag even had a chance to say anything, an indignant wail suddenly rang out from beside him. Mag faltered slightly as he turned toward the slightly tanned fatso standing behind Krasu. Why did this man look so familiar? I'm Abraham. The man's voice became even more indignant. Duke Abraham? How did you become like this? I thought you went back to Rhoda Midway. Mag's eyelids twitched, and only after taking a closer look was he able to verify that this really was Abraham. However, his skin had turned significantly darker than when he'd first met him in Rhodu, and he had clearly lost a lot of weight as well. Only 4 or 5 days had passed since their last encounter, so Mag wasn't able to recognize him initially. Just what had happened to him in these past few days? Duke. Everyone else also turned to Abraham with curious looks in their eyes. The title of Duke was one that was used only in the Roth Empire on the Norland continent, and it was an extremely prestigious title. All dukes were very important people in the Roth Empire, yet this tanned middle-aged man was supposed to be one of them? Why had he come to Chaos City? Let's not talk about that, Abraham replied with a depressed expression. He was a duke of the Roth Empire, yet he'd been forced to trek through the mountains for 3 days and almost starved to death because he'd overfed his falcon steed. This was far too embarrassing a story for him to tell. Go on, I really want to hear it. Amy had sat down on her little stool near the entrance, and was looking at Abraham with a curious expression as she asked, was it because your big fatty bird was too tired from flying and fell out of the sky? Or did you get lost along the way? Abraham's eyes abruptly widened, and he almost blurted out, holy shit! Did you see everything? You see that, ugly duckling? You can't let yourself get too fat. If you fall from the sky while flying, it's going to be super embarrassing, Amy said with a serious expression as she pinched Ugly Duckling's chubby cheeks. Abraham wore a dark expression on his face, and he wanted nothing more than to bury himself in the ground so he could escape from all of the amused eyes being directed at him. However, he simply couldn't bear to walk away from this restaurant. He had endured countless hardships and lost close to 10 kilograms of weight to get here, so he couldn't just leave. At the sight of Abraham's expression, Mag could tell that Amy had most likely struck the nail on the head. He repressed the urge to smirk as he said, the restaurant is now open for lunch. Welcome, everyone. Despite the conflicted emotions in his heart, Abraham still made his way into the restaurant in a determined manner. A bit of embarrassment certainly wasn't going to keep him from pursuing delicious food. All of the customers that had already been waiting for a long time also quickly entered the restaurant. Abraham, male, 43 years old, normal human, symptoms, swollen abdomen, many areas of necrosis in the stomach wall, acid reflux, lackluster suppleness in the stomach and intestines, constipation. Diagnosis: chronic gastric ulcers and inflammation with a high likelihood of developing into stomach cancer, coupled with chronic constipation. Vicenio, male, 29 years old, normal human, symptoms, excessively pale and colorless features, dry skin, weakness in the back and knees, mental exhaustion, cold extremities, back pain, decreasing memory functions. Diagnosis: severe impotence. Harrison, inside the kitchen, Mag inspected the strings of information flashing through his mind with a rather grim expression on his face. After installing the omniscient door, Mag had been made aware of many of the conditions that afflicted his customers, most of who appeared to be quite healthy on the outside. Of course, Vicenio was an exception to this. He always looked impotent, so it would have been quite strange had the system given any other diagnosis. However, it appeared that Abraham had some severe gastric issues. It was common knowledge that excessive consumption of food was quite taxing on the digestive system. Back in his past life, Mag had done his best to regulate his eating, but he had still ended up with some stomach issues. In contrast, Abraham's issues were far more severe than anything he'd experienced in his past life. If he didn't address these issues properly, he'd develop stomach cancer, and that was an incurable condition. Come to think of it, is cancer considered to be incurable in this world? Mag thought to himself curiously. This was an alternate world, after all, and gruesome injuries could be cured with a single spell here, so who was to say that magic couldn't cure cancer as well? In any case, he had to warn Abraham about the issues regarding his digestive system. Even if cancer was curable in this world, it certainly wasn't a desirable condition to have, and if Abraham were to continue like this, cancer would most likely be the end result. Yabimiya had begun taking orders from the customers, and even though the restaurant was completely packed, it wasn't rowdy in the slightest. All of the customers were either sitting in silence or conversing with acquaintances in hushed tones. There were no loud conversations, nor any arguments or conflicts. Abraham glanced at the menacing Minotaur demon and burly orc sitting across from him, and he was feeling rather uncomfortable. He finally understood why Mag had made that bet with the head chef of Kari's rotisserie back in Rodu. It was nothing personal, Mag simply didn't like how the restaurant was being run. In Mamie Restaurant, there was no discrimination between social classes, nor even any racial restrictions. Even as a Duke of the Roth Empire, Abraham had never shared a dining table with a demon and an orc before. However, there was also another man sitting at the table, and he displayed no fear at the sight of the Minotaur demon sitting beside him. His calmness extended a calming effect to Abraham as well, and he gradually relaxed. "Hello there, what would you like to order?" Yabimiya asked with a smile as she made her way over to him. "Let me see." Abraham opened the menu on the table, and a series of images of delicious dishes were revealed to him. Spicy grilled fish, delectable steak, alluring rugiemo. Every single dish looked so tempting, and Abraham was struggling to hold back his drool. "Why do I need to choose? Only a kid would need to make choices." Abraham closed the menu before turning to Yabimiya with a smile as he said, "I want one of every dish on this menu. Please ask Boss Mag to devise a suitable sequence for these dishes to be brought to me." "One of everything?" Yabimiya was rather hesitant to hear this. Giant dragons, trolls, and demons did indeed have a far bigger appetite than the average human, but no matter how she looked at him, Abraham clearly didn't fall into any of those aforementioned categories. How was he going to be able to eat so much food? All of the surrounding customers were also appraising Abraham with shock in their eyes. Setting aside how much it cost to order one of every dish on the menu, there was no way that a normal person would be able to eat all that food. After all, each person only had a single stomach. "That's right, I'll get one of everything." Abraham nodded in confirmation. He had starved himself for a few days prior to coming here, so his stomach was completely empty. He didn't want to miss out on any of the delicious dishes here. "All right, please wait a moment." Yabimiya nodded without asking any further questions. "Did you starve yourself before coming here?" Vicenio, who was sitting across from Abraham, asked with an astonished look in his eyes. Even though he was coming to Mamie Restaurant every day to replenish himself, he discovered that he had still underestimated just how lustful and insatiable a woman in her 30s was, and as opposed to improving his condition, he could only feel his impotence getting worse. He was only glad that his wife still didn't know about Mamie Restaurant at the moment. Otherwise, he couldn't imagine how he was supposed to satisfy a woman who had eaten rugiemo. "I never refuse any delicious food that comes my way," Abraham replied with a smile and a nod. Vicenio was the only other human on his table, so Abraham instantly felt a connection with him. In the past, he didn't have many opportunities to dine at the same table with a commoner, and he looked at the dark rings around Vicenio's eyes as he advised in a meaningful and heartfelt manner, "Young man, I advise you to exercise restraint. Otherwise, you're going to regret your decision when you grow older." Vicenio buried his face in his hand and heaved a long sigh upon hearing this. As a pretty boy, he had to make some sacrifices in order to continue living his current life. There was no turning back for him now, and no one was more aware than him of the negative effects of not exercising restraint. He was hoping to turn everything around through consuming Mag's food, but he found himself in a worse situation than he'd begun with. Mag was preparing to begin cooking when he heard Abraham making his order, and after a brief hesitation, he still decided to step in. Thus, he put down the cooking utensils in his hands before making his way directly over to Abraham with a smile on his face. "Duke Abraham, I don't have a habit of interfering with the orders made by my customers, but I have an obligation to look out for the health of my customers. As such, I suggest you limit your order to 2 or 3 dishes, and that you pick some dishes with milder flavors." "Why? I'm as healthy as a horse. With so many delicious dishes on the menu, how can I only choose 2 or 3? As for the flavor of the dishes, the stronger the better." "Are you sure you're not mistaken, Boss Mag?" Abraham appraised Mag with a confused expression as he patted his own chest as if to prove a point. All of the customers also turned to Mag with curiosity in their eyes. Mag had never interfered with any customer's order in the past, so why was he doing this now? Mag shook his head, and said, "Sometimes, conditions will only begin to manifest after things have deteriorated to a certain extent. Let me ask you this, Duke Abraham, have you been experiencing dull and swelling abdominal pain? Are those symptoms exacerbated right after your meals? On top of that, do you often get a scorching feeling in your chest with occasional bursts of stomach acid flowing back into your oral cavity?" 872 God of Cookery or God of Medicine. How did you know? Abraham had initially thought that Mag was only making something out of nothing, but his eyes abruptly widened with incredulity upon hearing this. Mag was completely right. He had been suffering from the aforementioned symptoms for many years. In the beginning, he didn't pay this any heed, but during recent times, the symptoms had been progressively worsening, to the extent that there were occasionally nights when he would wake up in agony. Only then did he reluctantly go to a doctor, and even the royal doctors in the palace had seen him for consultations. The root of the condition lay in his stomach, and healing spells had alleviated a lot of his symptoms, but all of the doctors he saw asked him to do the same thing: eat less. They advised following a diet of plain rice congee for an extended period of time in conjunction with treatment sessions from healers. However, this kind of treatment was akin to torture to him, so he refused to follow such a protocol without a second thought. If he couldn't eat the delicious foods he wanted, then he might as well be dead. Whenever the pain became too unbearable for him, he'd get a healer to alleviate his symptoms before rushing to the next restaurant. He had been living this way for many years, but he didn't think that Mag would be able to identify all of his symptoms just by looking at him. "Is Boss Mag a doctor as well?" Everyone could tell from Abraham's expression that Mag was right, and all of them turned to Mag with curiosity and surprise in their eyes. Mag maintained a calm expression as he replied, "I'm quite familiar with food, so I've also done some research into some conditions that can result from overeating. Your symptoms are already quite obvious, and if you don't address your condition, catastrophic consequences could follow, and in the worst-case scenario, you could even die. I cook delicious food for everyone to enjoy, I don't want to see my food inflicting harm on anyone." Due to the exceptional ingredients used in Mag's dish, all of them were very beneficial to consume, and they even possessed miraculous effects, such as Mag's spicy grilled fish that had managed to cure Vivian's chronic condition. However, regardless of how beneficial these dishes were to one's body, excessive consumption would result in negative consequences, especially for someone with chronic digestive conditions. Chronic gastric ulcers resulted in an extremely fragile stomach wall, and overeating under such circumstances could result in stomach perforation or hemorrhages. If Abraham were to eat one of every dish on the menu, that was around the amount of food a normal adult human would eat in 4 or 5 meals. He wasn't going to be directly killing Abraham, but Abraham could quite possibly die because of him. Mag simply couldn't stand by idly and allow this to happen, even if it were rather uncharacteristic for him to step in. Is it really that serious? Abraham was also slowly growing rather concerned at the sight of Mag's serious expression. In the past, many doctors had told him the same thing, but he'd never taken their advice to heart. After all, eating delicious food was so enjoyable, how could it possibly be bad for him? However, now that the same advice was being relayed by Mag, the most exceptional chef he'd ever seen, those words suddenly seemed to take on a different meaning. He respected any chef who could cook delicious food, regardless of their identity or status. Only by gaining an in-depth understanding of food and ingredients could one cook delicious dishes, and this was a skill that normal people didn't possess. In recent times, his symptoms had indeed been getting worse, and even healing spells were unable to completely repress them, but he'd never even considered that these issues could have been caused by eating delicious foods. As such, he was naturally growing quite uneasy. Each person only had one life, and he hadn't lived enough yet. Besides, he'd just discovered a treasure vault. Aside from spicy grilled fish, black pepper steak, and braised chicken and rice, there were so many more alluring dishes on that menu, he couldn't afford to die yet. That's right. I'm sure you've heard the same advice from doctors already. I hope you can look after yourself better for your own health so you can taste more delicious dishes in the future, Mag replied with a smile and a nod. Thankfully, Abraham wasn't as stubborn as he'd feared. Then, all right, Abraham opened the menu again and carefully inspected it for a while before amending, I'll get a fried rice, a sweet tofu pudding, and braised chicken and rice. Sure, please wait for a moment. Mag nodded before turning back to his kitchen. This was still slightly more than what a normal person would eat for a meal, but it was already a significant decrease for Abraham, so this was a good beginning. On top of that, all 3 of those dishes were quite nurturing to the stomach, so they would be beneficial to his condition. That's amazing. Boss Mag can diagnose people just by looking at them now. Chef plus doctor equals Boss Mag? That's incredible. I want Boss Mag to take a look at me now. Recently, I feel a really strong constricted feeling in my head as if it's being strangled by something. You don't need Boss Mag to take a look at you for that, old man, just loosen that headband that you're wearing, and your symptoms will immediately be alleviated. He looked so cool diagnosing customers in his chef's suit. As expected of the Boss Mag I know and love. Oi, 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 please calm down, you do realize that Boss Mag is also a man, right? So what? Can't you see that none of these women have managed to catch his fancy? Maybe Boss Mag likes men. Hee, I'm going to steal his heart for sure. Due to this brief interlude, all of the customers also began to discuss quietly among themselves. After all, everyone had an ailment or two that they couldn't be bothered to go to a doctor for. Furthermore, normal doctors couldn't diagnose patients just by looking at them like Mag could, so the demand for Mag as a doctor was steadily beginning to rise. Is he a doctor as well? Ferris was staring at Mag with a shocked expression. Elves cultivated nature magic, so most of them had good aptitude when it came to healing spells. However, even the best elven healers couldn't pinpoint a patient's condition just by looking at them. Boss really is so awesome. Yabimiya was looking at Mag with admiration overflowing from her eyes. As he listened to the conversations between the customers, an amused smile appeared on Mag's face, and he suggested, "System, how about you open a clinic for me on the side? That'll be much more profitable than selling food. All you have to do is supply me with medicine." As a candidate to become the god of cookery, how can you pursue other occupations before you've honed your cooking skills to an acceptable level? On top of that, a true god of cookery doesn't need to sell medicine, as his dishes are the best forms of medicine that can bring health and prosperity to his customers, the system said in a proud voice. So you're saying dishes are medicine? Am I the god of cookery of the god of medicine? Mag raised an eyebrow as he envisioned the following scenario in his mind. Customer, Boss Mag, what can I do about my current condition? You'll be fine. Just take a spicy grilled fish and a Yangzhou fried rice together twice a day and you'll be cured in no time. That was a rather strange scenario to Mag. 873 The princess would support me, right? Mag switched on the stove, then turned to Ferris with a smile, and said, I don't have a habit of speaking while I cook, as I feel that's disrespectful to the ingredients, so you'll have to watch and learn as much as you can. Ferris immediately nodded with an earnest look on her face. Thus, Mag didn't say anything further as he ladled some oil into the pan, allowing it to heat up before adding the spices. All types of ingredients were then added in an extremely well-rehearsed sequence, and watching Mag cook was like witnessing a graceful dance as he controlled the pan and spatula in an expert manner. Ferris looked on from the side, completely entranced by what she saw. Her cooking style ensured that each and every step was completed to perfection, thereby ensuring the consistency of the flavor of her dishes. However, as a result of this, her cooking was rather wooden and robotic. However, watching Mag cook was quite a sensual experience. His lithe and powerful body appeared as if it had combined into one with the pan in his hand, and despite the weight of the heavy black metal pan, he was able to control it to perfection as if it were as light as a feather. And this was only the beginning. Soon, Mag began adding pots and pans to the stovetops. Before Ferris knew it, there were 4 dishes being cooked on the stovetop at once, consisting of 2 portions of Yangzhou fried rice and 2 portions of black pepper steak. At the same time, there were around 100 kebabs being roasted on the rack, and Mag was able to keep track of all of these dishes at once in a calm and graceful manner. He made no extra unnecessary movements as he traversed from one cooking station to another, and despite the amount of workload he was taking on all at once, the process wasn't chaotic in the slightest. Soon, the fried rice was ready, the steaks were plated, cumin powder was applied to the beef kebabs, and one delicious dish after another was carried out to the eagerly awaiting customers. Ferris' eyes lit up further and further as she looked on from the side. If she were in his shoes, she wouldn't even be able to keep up this speed if she were only cooking one dish at a time, let alone so many at once. What was even more incredible was that despite the number of dishes he was cooking at a time, each and every dish was still cooked to perfection, without any discrepancies in appearance between one dish and the other. An alluring aroma began to waft through the air, and even though Ferris had just had lunch, she was still beginning to salivate uncontrollably. She could hear a steady stream of praise from the customers outside, and all of them wore blissful smiles on their faces as their attention was drawn entirely to the delicious dishes before them. Ferris didn't doubt the authenticity of their reactions even for a single instant, as she had tasted these very same dishes during lunch earlier, and she knew just how extraordinary they were. If possible, I also want to become a chef just like him. A thought that had never occurred to Ferris suddenly sprang into her mind, and it quickly took root firmly in her heart. Ever since she could remember, her life had constantly revolved around Princess Irina. She'd learned flower arrangement, cooking, massage. Everything she did was so that she could better serve the princess and make her happy. However, she had never thought about what she wanted for herself. In her world, there was only the princess and no one else, yet for the first time ever, she wanted to do something for herself. Perhaps it was because she'd left the wind forest and been shown a whole new world, but she suddenly found that she was unable to rid herself of this desire. The princess was still extremely important to her, but she now had a dream. She wanted to become a chef who could bring joy to his customers like Mag. This was a simple yet bold target. The princess would support me, right? Ferris was still rather concerned, but as she cast her gaze toward Mag, a determined look appeared in her eyes. Here's your Yangzhou fried rice. Yabimiya placed the first dish in front of Duke Abraham, who was feeling slightly dejected and anxious after hearing Mag's words of warning, but his eyes immediately lit up at the sight of the dish that had been placed before him. Fried rice was considered to be a dish consumed by commoners, and stalls that sold this dish were quite prevalent on the food streets of Rodu. Most of the time, the dish was cooked using eggs and rice. Some chefs would add some other ingredients to make their fried rice more unique, but those two were the main ingredients used. As a veteran foodie, Abraham had also tasted some fried rice, but aside from the fried rice he'd had once on the Renhe food street, he hadn't tasted any other fried rice that had struck him with the urge to eat it again in the future. However, the appearance of this so-called Yangzhou fried rice came as quite a surprise to him. At first glance, the combination of so many ingredients seemed to be rather chaotic, and in the world of professional chefs, this was often frowned upon as it was very difficult to make a dish taste harmonious with too many ingredients thrown into the mix. However, the aroma that was wafting toward him was posing a stern challenge to this preconceived notion. The aromas of the ingredients in the dish were so rich and alluring that Abraham couldn't help but be swayed in his beliefs. After inspecting the dish closely, the surprise in Abraham's eyes grew even more pronounced. All of the ingredients had been diced into rice-sized pieces, including even the green peas. What was even more incredible to him was that the grains of rice had been covered in egg. As opposed to the fried rice dishes he'd seen in the past, where the egg had been separated from the rice, the egg in this dish perfectly coated the grains of rice to give them a shimmering golden hue, but none of the individual grains of rice clumped together as a result. How has he achieved this effect? Abraham had never seen fried rice like this before. The delectable aroma in the air was making his empty stomach rumble loudly, and he couldn't help but pick up his spoon, scooping a spoonful of fried rice into his mouth. The fragrance of chopped green onions and eggs tickled his nose, the texture of grain-sized shrimp and ham was so smooth, and the egg-coated rice had a sweet flavor after being chewed well. Tastes of every ingredient melted in his mouth and tickled his taste buds. Even when it was all swallowed, the residual flavors still lingered in his mouth. This is incredible. A stunned expression appeared on Abraham's face. All of his prior doubts had been completely erased. Not only had the multitude of ingredients not affected the taste of the dish in the slightest, they only worked to produce more layers of complexity in texture and flavor to the dish. I can't believe a simple fried rice dish could taste so good. As expected of Boss Mag. At this point, Abraham found himself simply unable to stop eating as he scooped up one spoonful of fried rice into his mouth after another. The delectable flavor of the dish blossomed on the tip of his tongue, and he felt as if all of the hardships he'd endured during the past few days weren't even worthy of a mention in the pursuit of such an extraordinarily delicious dish. Ding! All of a sudden, his spoon struck his plate, and he looked down to find that he'd already finished the entire dish before he knew it. He immediately raised his hand, and said, "Please get me one more, no, 3 more portions of this dish. With all due respect, didn't you just make a promise to boss?" Yabimiya said as she turned to Abraham with a resigned look on her face. Abraham's face fell as he cast his gaze toward the kitchen, and after a brief internal conflict, he sighed, "All right, next time, then. Not being able to eat as much as I want of such delicious dishes is simply far too painful." Abraham slumped down in his chair in a dejected manner while waiting for the next dish to be brought out to him. "I heard the owner of this restaurant has a half-elf daughter who's around 4 years old?" A figure wearing a straw hat suddenly stopped outside the restaurant. 874 It must be because Father's smile is too handsome, right? Through the use of the omniscient door, Mag could see all of the ailments that his customers were suffering from, but he didn't go around handing out diagnoses to everyone. After all, there were no perfectly healthy people in the world, and it was only normal to have a few niggles here and there. Furthermore, he was a chef and a restaurant owner, so he really wasn't qualified to practice medicine. Just because he could diagnose everyone's conditions, it didn't mean he knew how to cure them. However, if there were some regular customers with extremely severe conditions that had to be addressed as quickly as possible, then Mag would commit these customers and their corresponding conditions to memory. He didn't know how to cure them, but he would find chances in the future to issue a few gentle warnings to them. After all, it went against his character to remain silent despite having knowledge that could help others. During the cooking process, Mag would cast an occasional furtive glance at Ferris, and he was very pleased to see the earnest look in her eyes. Her attitude made it very rewarding for him to continue to teach her. Mag had once seen a quote that went along the lines of, "Not all successful people are geniuses, but most of them work extremely hard." In the art of cooking, he was a complete noob. Even with the system's assistance and all of the perfect experience bags he'd been given, the true key to his success was his ability to grind and put in all those hard hours in the test field for the god of cookery. Ferris clearly possessed far superior aptitude compared to him, and it appeared that her attitude was very commendable as well. "Miss Mia, is there really no way for us to order stinky tofu for lunch? Can you get Boss Mag to make a portion for me? After tasting it yesterday, it's been the only thing that I can think about, and I can't even concentrate on anything else that I'm doing," Harrison said as he looked up at Yabimiya in a hopeful manner. "I really want to eat it too. That flavor is simply unforgettable. If Boss Mag is willing to serve stinky tofu for lunch, then please give me a portion as well." A few more customers immediately chimed in as they turned to Yabimiya with expectant looks in their eyes. Yabimiya was always quite pleasant and accommodating, but on this occasion, she shook her head firmly, and replied, "I'm sorry, but I can't. Boss says that stinky tofu can only be served during the dinner service, and only 100 portions will be served in total." Harrison and the other customers were all very dejected to hear this, and they were already beginning to think about coming back early for dinner so they didn't miss out on the 100 portions being served. Abraham was just enjoying a portion of sweet tofu pudding when he overheard this conversation, and he asked, "Stinky tofu? What's that? Why isn't it on the menu?" Generally speaking, dishes that were so unforgettable to customers were always exceptional dishes. This was something that he'd deduced during his years as a veteran foodie. Vicenio replied, "It's a dish that Boss Mag only just released yesterday, and it's only sold during the dinner service. I've heard that it really stinks, so I don't plan on ever trying it." "It stinks?" Abraham was rather surprised to hear this. He had tasted delicious cuisine all over the continent, but he'd never had anything that stank before. A truly exceptional dish had to excel in appearance, aroma, and taste. How could a stinky dish possibly fit under that category, and why was it so unforgettable to those customers? Abraham was becoming more and more curious as he followed this train of thought. "That's right, I've heard that it's a flavor that you'll never forget after eating it once. All of the people who've ordered it have displayed extremely strong reactions. There was one guy who tried to rush out the door, and little Amy almost took his head off with a fireball, thinking that he was trying to get a free meal." A hint of lingering fear flashed through Vicenio's eyes as he thought back to the intense sequence of events that had unfolded the day before. If it weren't for the fact that the customer in question had turned around just in time, that fireball would have struck him on the back of the head. "That's very interesting." Abraham was only becoming more intrigued by the second. Just how stinky would a dish have to be to evoke such a reaction? "It sure is." Vicenio also wore an intrigued look on his face. After all, everyone liked delicious food, but it was the first time he'd ever seen anyone enjoy stinky food. "You haven't had it, so you wouldn't understand. The stinkiness only stems from an extremely rich fragrance, so when a dish is stinky to a certain point, it goes back to become fragrant. This is something you'll only be able to interpret after you eat it," Harrison said in a slow voice, but from the glazed-over look in his eyes, it was quite clear that he was already somewhere else in his mind. "I have to try this dish for dinner. Even if it really does smell absolutely abhorrent, so be it, I can't afford to miss out on a dish like this," Abraham thought to himself. At this point, he'd already finished his tofu pudding, which was the last of the 3 dishes that he'd ordered. Even though he still wanted more, he could only reluctantly pay the bill before departing. After walking out of the restaurant, he turned back to look at the sign hanging above the door as he sighed. I haven't set foot outside of Rodua for 45 years, but it looks like I'll be staying for the rest of my life in Chaos City now. The busy lunch service concluded, and Mag put down the pan in his hand as he turned off all of the stovetops. He heaved a faint sigh, and just as he was about to wipe the sweat from his forehead, a warm towel was handed over to him. Mag faltered slightly upon seeing this, and then turned to discover Firis offering the towel to him with a faint blush on her face. After a brief hesitation, he accepted the towel and wiped his hands and forehead with it before handing it back to Firis with a smile. "Thanks. Why, you're welcome." Firis' blush became even more pronounced as she quickly rushed out the door with the towel in her hands. This was the first time she'd served anyone aside from the princess, and it was a man. Just the thought of this made her feel as if her heart were about to jump out of her throat. However, she was doing this purely out of the admiration in her heart. She couldn't imagine how a normal human had been able to bring so much joy to so many customers during a short span of less than 2 hours. In her eyes, Mag was practically glowing with radiance. "Big Sister Firis, why is your face so red?" Amy asked with a curious expression as she held Ugly Duckling in her arms. Firis was at a loss for how to respond. "It must be because Father's smile is too handsome, right?" Amy asked with a smile. Firis immediately thought back to Mag's warm smile upon hearing this. It was indeed very handsome. "It's all right, Father smiles like that at everyone, so he doesn't feel anything special for you," Amy reassured. Firis, thus, the lunch service drew to an official conclusion after Sally used her water-type magic to clean up the entire restaurant and the kitchen. Yabimiya strapped her little bag to her back, and then smiled at everyone as she said, "See you later, boss, Amy, Firis. We're going to the ice cream now. I'm going to back to sleep and read. See you soon." Babla also left with Mia and the others. Thus, Mag, Amy, and Firis were the only ones left in the restaurant. Firis was feeling rather awkward, but there was no place for her to go. As time passed, she was only beginning to feel more awkward, and she could only look down at her shoes, not daring to look up at Mag. Mag appraised the anxious Firis with a smile, and he was able to guess the thoughts that were running through her mind as he said, "If you don't have any place to go, you can stay and rest in the restaurant. I'll be teaching you some things that you can do in the afternoon. Oh, I almost forgot, tomorrow is a rest day for the restaurant, so your official first day on the job will be delayed for a day. However, the restaurant is going to be expanded and upgraded soon, so you can truly begin cooking once you officially start." Firis immediately looked up upon hearing this, and a surge of warmth flowed through her heart at the sight of Mag's trusting eyes. She nodded in an earnest manner, and said, "I'll be sure to work hard." "Firis? Why is she here?" A figure outside the floor-to-ceiling window pane was looking into the restaurant, surprised. SAHDR had been in Chaos City for close to a month now, and he'd been searching for Alex this entire time. Much to his surprise, a piece of news that shook the entire continent was spread from Rodua a few days ago. Alex was still alive, and he'd slain 4 10th-tier powerful beings on his own, including the patriarch of the spatial demons, Benson. This came as a complete shock to everyone across the entire continent, including SAHDR himself. 3 years ago, all of the information that he'd gathered indicated that Alex had been completely crippled, and that it was impossible for him to recover from those injuries. Otherwise, those beings that stood at the pinnacle of the Norland continent would have never allowed Alex to emerge from that rainy night alive. They only wanted him to live as a cripple so he could suffer pain that was worse than death. However, 3 years later, he was back, and he was just as powerful as ever. All of the beings who had played a role in his assassination were in complete disbelief. Even a divine deity shouldn't have been able to heal those injuries. SAHDR was also in disbelief because if all this were true, just how stupid did those beings have to be to have allowed Alex to survive? 10th-tier powerful beings were extremely rare even across the entire Norland continent. How could they have made such a stupid mistake? There was only one knight in the entire history of the Norland continent capable of killing 3 10th tier powerful beings as well as Benson along with his eye beast on his own, and that was Alex. Of course, what served as even more concrete proof of his return was that his purple-striped griffin, which had disappeared for 3 years as well, had also reappeared. There was no one in this world aside from Alex who could tame that griffin. This news created a massive stir across the entire continent, and countless powerful beings were undoubtedly suffering sleepless nights as a result. SAHDR was very elated that the princess had reunited with Alex, and he wasn't disheartened in the slightest that all the work he'd done in the past 3 years had gone to waste. After all, this was most definitely good news. However, just as he was about to return to the Wind Forest, another piece of shocking news emerged: Irina had been deposed as princess by the panel of elders. This piece of news had also shaken the entire Norland continent. If it weren't for the existence of Alex, Irina would most definitely be the most powerful being on the entire continent among the current younger generation. Even while being attacked by 6 10th tier powerful beings, she'd managed to kill 3 of them, which was an extraordinary feat that very few people on the continent could achieve. With the lengthy lifespans that all elves possessed, it was almost scary to imagine what kind of heights she'd scale to in the future. However, just as everyone had thought that she would become the next elven queen for sure, she was deposed during the ceremony. SAHDR was quite surprised by this news, but he could also deduce the factors that had led to this. He'd also heard that Alex had appeared in the Wind Forest on the same day, and that Irina was now in seclusion in her cave, so at the very least, she was still alive. As Irina's right-hand man, he naturally couldn't return to the Wind Forest at a time like this. As such, he was very concerned about Firis. He'd heard that Alex had arrived at Chaos City 2 days ago before announcing a firm stance against mercenary squads that hunted down elves, and that an elven woman had accompanied him at the time. Thus, he'd been wandering Chaos City for the past 2 days in order to tie up all of the loose ends in his investigation as well as to search for Firis. Much to his surprise, Firis was in this very restaurant, and this discovery filled him with both elation and befuddlement. During this recent period of time, he'd expended a lot of effort to search for Alex and his daughter. Even though he hadn't found any concrete leads, all of the information that he'd gathered suggested that Chaos City was the likeliest place for the 2 of them to be. After investigating the few half-elves in Chaos City, everything seemed to be pointing toward this Mamie restaurant. Now that Alex had returned, there was no need for him to continue investigating this restaurant, but his curiosity still urged him to come here and give himself some closure in his investigation. Thus, found himself outside the restaurant, looking at Firis with a shocked expression on his face. From what she's wearing, it appears that she's an employee of this restaurant already. Is this just a coincidence, or was it by design? SAHDR turned away from the restaurant and inspected Mag out of the corners of his eyes. Just as SAHDR was getting wrapped up in his own thoughts, the restaurant doors were opened, and a half-elf little girl emerged with a curious look on her face. "Your hat looks really good, Uncle Straw Hat, did you weave it yourself?" "What?" An incredulous look immediately appeared in SAHDR's eyes. This half-elf little girl had blue eyes, long silver hair, and a little pair of virtually translucent pointy ears. Her intricate facial features looked as if they'd been carved out of a block of the finest jade, and she was the spitting image of Irina in her childhood. SAHDR appeared to be a young man, but he was actually already 200 years old. Even so, he was considered to be quite young in the elven race. As someone who'd been designated to protect Princess Irina by the Elven Queen, he'd watched her grow up through every stage of her life. Even though he was nowhere near as powerful as the princess now, he could still clearly remember what the princess had looked like as a child. This little girl was a half-elf, but her facial features were almost completely identical to those of a younger Irina, so how could he not be surprised? "Do you not know how to talk? Are you a mute?" A hint of pity immediately appeared in Amy's eyes, and she cast a quick glance back at the restaurant before carefully pulling out a copper coin that she handed over to SAHDR as she whispered, "Go buy some food for yourself, Uncle Straw Hat." I saved this up in secret, so you can't let father know. SAHDR looked at the pure smile on Amy's face and the copper coins being held in her little hands, and he experienced a sense of déjà vu, just as if he were looking at the princess as a little girl who was holding a snowball in her hands. He was wearing tattered clothes and an old straw hat, so he really did look like a homeless man at the moment. After a brief hesitation, SAHDR accepted the copper coin before giving Amy a warm smile, and then taking a final glance at the restaurant before slowly departing. Regardless of whether he had guessed right or not, the best thing he could do for now was clearly to leave everything as it currently was. As for approaching Ferris to ask her about what had happened in the Wind Forest, that would just have to wait until a more suitable opportunity arose. Back when Alex had appeared in Rodu, there was a sign on this restaurant's door stating that the owner had gone to Rodu to cook for the king. When Alex had appeared in the Wind Forest and Chaos City a few days ago, the owner of this restaurant had gone out for a day to procure new ingredients. Too many coincidences simply culminated in irrefutable truths. After ascertaining all that, SAHDR sped up even further, and quickly disappeared into the crowd on the plaza. What a strange uncle! Amy shook her head before setting Ugly Duckling down in front of the restaurant to play with it. At this moment, a middle-aged man in a catering association uniform made his way over to Amy with a smile, and asked, "Little girl, is the owner of this restaurant here?"